I'd like to call this workshop meeting of the West South Milwaukee School Board to order. Suzette, can you please do the roll?
Yes. Ms. Deal,
Here.
Mr. Sikich,
Present.
Mr. Keller,
Here.
Mrs. Carr,
Here.
Mr. Eustruck,
Here.
Mr. Burns,
Here.
Mrs. Justum, I was told might be joining remotely. So, are you present, Mrs. Justum? No, not right now. Okay. Mrs. Kaiser
Present.
and President Lee.
Here. All right, so here we are for our second workshop for the FACT team. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Luxman and Mr. Eichmann.
Great. Welcome, everybody, and I'm glad to be in the room with everybody. And sorry I missed the first workshop on our facility master planning process, but the feedback that I got was pretty good. That as the board, what was shared was you all were super engaged in this, super interested in kind of let's keep this moving. What are the next steps? How do we actually get this done? So I think that's really encouraging for our team to know that there's some energy kind of coming forward to support the work. And so today we want to take the next steps in working through. So a little bit of just where we are in our timeline, right? So this is our second workshop, and today we'll do a little bit of presentation of the FACT experience, and we have a couple members of FACT here. And just I also asked Amy and Jeff, because they went through the entire FACT process, to also reflect a little bit on what their process was like, and there'll be some guided questions to help folks that were part of the FACT experience respond to help inform the rest of the board of what that experience was like. Then we're going to present the FACT recommendations, so the recommendations that came out of the process. And I've shared a little bit about this already, is that we were surprised in a good way by how much consensus really did come out of the process. And it's not universal. I don't think that would be a realistic expectation. But that there's quite a bit of consensus around the big ideas that came out of the process. We're going to get to see some of the conceptual designs. So we'll take a look at an example of what would happen to an elementary school in this, what would happen to middle schools, and then the big question is, what does the one combined high school look like? And we're going to see examples of both a central version and a Nathan Hale version, so that you can see kind of the work that went in the background. You're also going to see some of the preliminary cost estimates, and this is where your eyes might start getting big, because ours sure did. And that's why I think I've communicated over the process that this became much bigger in scope than I think we imagined at the beginning, given kind of the age of the buildings and what we're trying to accomplish. And so that's why the idea of this is probably multiple efforts to get this done. Then we'll learn some more about the community survey process, so how we get more input broadly from the community about the big ideas here. And then there'll be some group discussion today, so that we have a chance to do some Q&A with one another and with other folks that are here. Again, just a Ray and C.G. Schmidt team, so they're in the room with us, and I don't think we need to go through that one in detail. So just so you see where we are, the Facility Advisory Community Team, right? So in the box there, that has wrapped up. And so now we're in the process with the board. Just a reminder of just there were 10 committee meetings of the FACT team. So that was 40 committee members. So we've got about 800 hours of collective effort kind of into this now, not counting kind of what we're doing with it. So you can go ahead. So again, the following information we found online. We just want to remind anybody that's watching from the public. So all the background information, the studies, the support materials, every single presentation, every press release is all available publicly. And we just want to keep reiterating that, because there will be more and more eyes on this as we get to a decision-making point and the board starts to give some direction. So any questions, we continually refer people back to all of this information. And then where the community survey starts to land, right? And so we'll learn much more about that today, and when we get to a point where we're ready to launch it, when we get information back, and how that starts to influence decision-making. And then finally, for me, just again, we start every one of these with the big ideas of the guiding principles. And these were the very original words that we started to use about how do we kind of remodel, reshape, renovate a building so that we really get the kind of spaces we need, and how can we do it in a way that's affordable. And it really, the kind of refined messaging now really is how do we right size, how do we modernize, and how we do it in a way that's affordable, right? So those are really kind of tight messages now. Right size, modernize, make it affordable as much as we can. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Steve.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to talk about the recommendation that came out of the FACT team for the board. And we started meeting together as a team back in January of '21. As you can tell from this, the timeline, we've been working internally on this for about a year before we got to this point. And so we started meeting in January. We had meetings every 3 weeks. So for 6 months, we had meetings. And the makeup was one parent from each school, one staff member from each school, school leaders, 2 board members, and then community stakeholders. And we met for 2 hours each time. And again, you can see the committee was charged with those overarching guiding principles, again, that Dr. Lexman just went over. So over that 6 months, the FACT committee carefully reviewed and discussed all the information that was provided to us by Bray Architects, by C.G. Schmidt, district leaders and staff. And when we say information provided by Bray and C.G. Schmidt, what they did is they had contractors come in and we went through every single site and we looked at all the infrastructure of every single school. They looked at the electrical systems, the plumbing systems, the HVAC systems, flooring, ceiling, interior walls, exterior walls, windows. I mean, they went over everything and documented the state and the condition that everything was in. And so when we say the information provided, that's what we mean. It is not just conceptual drawings, but it's actually the really heart and soul and the meat of how our district is, schools are made up and what they consist of. And so some of the highlights you can see from the meeting were there was, like I said, a review of the existing facilities and then the building capacity. Because as you know, we've been in the midst of declining enrollment for a few years, but we're still operating the same number of schools. There were presentations like you received last week on school finance, kind of the 30,000-foot view of that, how it works, how that translates into when districts do a bond referendum, how that may play into individual householders' taxes. The educational and operational considerations for all of our facilities. We know what they're at or where they're at, but how do we want them to be, and what do our students deserve them to be? And then also we had teacher panel discussions. One of, I think, the most eye-opening for a lot of people is when we had the teachers do a presentation at Frank Lloyd Wright. And they had a presentation where they showed some of the classrooms that they're working in. And from their perspective, I mean this in a good way, but it almost looked like an episode of Hoarders because they have so much stuff that, they absolutely need in their classroom. They talked about, having cramped spaces and having it be difficult for the students to actually have space to work together. And that if they were, doing something in one part of the classroom and they turned something on, then it tripped the breaker for the entire classroom and possibly other ones as well. Because the buildings just aren't wired to be able to handle all of the electrical devices and some of the other equipment that they use nowadays. And then also we looked at some, as Dr. Lexman said again, and you'll see tonight, we looked at some conceptual plans for the different grade levels, the elementary, the intermediate school, and also the high school. And so the recommendation that the FACT team agreed on are as follows. And I'll read these so that the benefit of anybody that may be on Zoom or for the recording, they'll know what they say. First one was to continue to operate facilities with our current grade configuration. Elementary schools serving students 4-year-old kindergarten through 5th grade, intermediate schools serving students 6th grade through 8th grade, and high schools serving students 9th grade through 12th grade. The next recommendation was reduce the number of school facilities across our district to align with enrollment projections, increase operational efficiencies, reduce long-term administrative and maintenance costs, operate 8 elementary schools, 2 intermediate schools, 1 comprehensive high school, and 1 smaller project-based learning high school. And then gather feedback for next steps by conducting a Board of Education approved third-party district-wide community survey in fall of 2021, hosting community engagement sessions, and conducting facility tours to gather input from stakeholders. And if you've looked at the website and some of the information that we went through, because as you know, when we were going through the heart of all of this, we were still in the middle of the pandemic. So we did make some videos that went through and it talked about the elementary schools, the intermediate schools, and the high schools. And we tried as best we could in those videos to depict what some of the conditions in the buildings are like. But until you actually do a physical tour of the facilities, I don't think you get a real true understanding of what the, some of the buildings are like. And then also they agreed that we feel that much can be accomplished when a learning community has access to the physical space needed to ensure college, career, and life readiness for all students. And we're confident in our recommendation and look forward to next steps from the Board of Education and our community. Then what we did to solidify this is we did a survey of the 46 voting members of FACT, and we had 43 of the 46 did respond. So you can see that that's 93.5% of those that were eligible to participate in the poll or the survey did participate. There also were several reminders that were sent out as we got closer to the ending date of the survey, because we wanted to, our goal was to get 100%, and we feel that we came pretty close. That I think 93.5% of any survey is a good representative sample. One of the things that I wanted to point out too, and we did go over this, I think a little bit last time when we were looking at the pathways, is that over on where it says the FACT meeting number 9 homework, there's a note there that says identification of specific buildings to be idled is not planned as part of our final recommendation. That is something that, that was one of the recommendations, but in turn it was an overarching recommendation. It wasn't a recommendation to identify specific schools. It was just the principle, this is what we think we need to do for operational efficiencies and other reasons. And then you can see that the survey results are on this chart, or this table. And question number 1 was a grade configuration. And what we did is throughout all of this, we had small group discussions during our meetings. We had large group discussions. We did pulse surveys where we typically did the green, yellow, and the red, where the green was, yes, I support this. Yellow is that I can live with it. And red was, no, I can't support this. And we did the same format then for these questions. And you can see the percentages here for each of these 5 questions that we had. And as Dr. Lexman alluded to, we were pleasantly surprised at the consistency and the support around these different questions. And that's the last part of this.
Good evening, everyone. So the next part of our presentation tonight, and I think I need to be closer to the microphone if I can switch spots with you. No, you're good, Mira. Is to get some perspective from some of our FACT team members. And we had a couple of members who are going to be here tonight who are not here at the present moment. But we do have one of our students who is on the panel with us, as well as Matt Lesser, who was on the FACT team with us throughout the whole process, who's on Zoom right now. And then we had Jeff and Amy, who were serving as Amy as a parent and then as a board member in that role. So if you guys just want to introduce yourselves, and then I'm going to ask you a couple of questions about the process.
Hi, my name is Amira O'Day. I am going to be a senior at Nathan Hale High School this year.
And Amy and Jeff, obviously everybody knows who you guys are. And Matt is the principal at Nathan Hale High School, who is also, again, on our FACT team, and he participates with us on APT, which is that planning meeting that happens behind the scenes. So the first question that we wanted to ask everyone is how easy or hard was it for you to separate your individual role within our school district to assist FACT in making a recommendation for our whole district? So, Amira, if you want to start. So as a student who only goes to one of our 2 high schools, how hard was it for you to see that whole big picture of our district and the FACT team to be able to help make a recommendation to our board as to what we should do next?
It definitely was overwhelming at first, just to like get all this information, and from a student standpoint, I'd always have to like look over it to make sure I know 100% what I'm looking at. But from a student's perspective, I think it was easier to look at like elementary and middle school. For high school, it's definitely harder because I am so used to having having just it always being like 2 high schools. But seeing middle and elementary, it was easier because I've been away for so long and I could wrap my head around these situations more so than high school. But I'd always look back and see like, okay, well, in the future, and how would this benefit us if I wasn't in this role? And how can it make our school district better? Not just being a neutral person, not seeing any of this information.
Yeah, Jeff, how about you?
I kind of just, because I was on there the whole time as a board member, I kind of just sat and absorbed stuff and listened. I didn't really want to give any opinions to slant anybody one way or the other way, them knowing that, you know, I'm a past teacher and blah, blah, blah. So I just listened, and I'm just going to use a short story here to explain where I'm coming from. I used to be a season ticket holder and still am with the Milwaukee Brewers. When they wanted to build this new stadium, I was like, there's nothing wrong with County Stadium. Look at the grass is green, the seats are great. Well, then they took us all on a tour of the guts of the place. We're lucky it didn't fall down on us because it was just the concrete was chipping and rotting away. And that's the stuff that I think the general public doesn't see. They go to their child's school and go, hey, look at a nice bulletin board. Oh, halls are clean. This is great. But if they saw the inner workings, I think they'd be shocked. And some of the buildings we're in, I was shocked. It's like, wow. So I guess I just give my opinion, but the meeting part, the fact part is done, so there's nobody to hear that. But I was blown away at some of the things I didn't anticipate seeing.
Amy, how about for you?
I think for me, it was a very emotional experience, to be honest, for me, because I started as a parent on the committee and then switched over to that school board. And as a parent, I'm really, joined the board to advocate, obviously, for what's best for all of our students, but I'm thinking about my kids, my neighborhood. I think so for me, a lot of it, like I would walk out of those, or not walk out of, but I would leave those meetings and shut my computer, and I would just feel emotionally drained because it's hard when you're talking about your schools. And in my case, we've been in the school district I think we're going on our 14th or 15th year. We're very invested in the school. I have 10 more years. So for me, it's like when you start talking about idling schools, and even though you know it's what's best for our community financially, for the kids, all that type of stuff, it's very hard when you think about your own community being affected. So for me, it was, as a parent, it was a very emotional experience, and it was very difficult sometimes to take myself out of that role, or to take myself out and look at it from a bigger perspective. And I think there were other people on the committee too, but I think by the time we came around at the end, obviously my role had changed, but I think you're able to see that more. But when we first started, it was after those meetings, I was like, ooh, I gotta go to bed now. I'm exhausted. Like it's a lot of information. It's a very educational experience, but it was just, when you start talking about changes you're going to be making in people's lives and your own lives, in the educational communities that we have here. It's just, it's tough. A lot of really hard questions came up, so.
Yeah, and Matt is with us on Zoom, I think. Matt can hear us. Brandon?
So I'm going to echo a little bit what Mr. Sickett said,
That's Jeff.
having one of the questions about one high school or two high school. I'd like to hear people talk before I really got involved. So often I was like a note taker and putting comments in different documents, and then it was able to share. Tried to do that at the end of the discussions. But what I found really neat about the process is the way it was rolled out about just looking at the facts and not attaching to like, you know, up front, it was like, we're not talking about schools closing or where it's going to be or which one or where the location is necessary. You know, those discussions happened, but it was more about, you know, capacities and assessments and about the things that needed to be done in each building to get it up to standard and all those different things. So I thought it very factual, and it was fairly easy to separate from that, looking at just what's in the best interest of the students and what kind of learning environments we're looking for as a district. And being here going on my 13th year, I've been through a lot of different things and seen a lot of different pieces to the puzzle go on. And it was nice to be part of those discussions like that. And I was kind of fascinated by those grade level discussions too. And I know we're getting, you know, moving into maybe a question on that, but the grade level discussions at the different levels was pretty fascinating to hear how that would impact different buildings and the kids' learning and the opportunities and all that, and just hearing all that input. So it was a really neat process, I thought.
Matt, while we're on that question, while you're on that topic, we'll jump into the next question, and I'll let you go first. So why did the team move away from a K-8 recommendation? So that was one of the questions that our board had. After our first discussion, they were a little surprised that we moved totally away from that K-8 recommendation. From your perspective, being on the team, why do you think that is?
I know.
Matt, can you hear us?
Okay, well, we will move on to our next participant, and we'll see if Matt doesn't jump back on. But Mary, why don't you share, why did the team move away from that K-8 recommendation?
From my perspective, I kind of was honestly hooked to 6 through 12. It was more shocking. Not a lot of people like that. But I think both had pros and cons, and it definitely, I think the K through 8 would have had great pros, but also I did see I was very set to the 6 through 12, so I kind of saw the cons of K through 8. And I just think it would have been a really big switch, and leading with pros and cons, I just don't think we really wanted to make that jump, and so people were set on, let's just keep it how it is, and it works now, of course, since we're always doing it. Let's not mess anything up. But I can see why it was really hard to make a decision for that, because some kids could do great with K through 8, and some kids could really fail with them, and there's going to be negatives with everything, so.
And Jeff, we'll pass it on to you.
Oh, in my small group, when we did, you know, how we talked about it and we break in our small groups, our small group was almost, the majority were just like, that's too big of an age gap. And that's the one time I shared with my group an experience. My first 5 years of teaching was in a K-8, and I would never want my kids to go to a K-8. I think the young kids grow up too fast, and the old kids don't mature quick enough, if you can kind of get where I'm coming from. And then just the numbers that could produce, I don't think is conceptually great with what we're trying to do for our students.
Yeah, and Amy, we'll pass it on to you, and then see if we can't get Matt back.
I mean, when we did our small group, we were trying to split. I'll be honest, I was an advocate for the K-8, but I think once we had discussion, it was, if you saw the survey results that we got from that group discussion, it was very divided. So it was like people really, really liked the K-8 idea, or they really, really hated it. And I think it just got to a consensus where we're looking at something like, kind of like, yeah, we're just sticking with something that we kind of know and not introducing something new to the community.
And we'll see if Matt jumps back into the conversation. But it was also size of school, like Jeff was saying. The size of each school, if we were all to go to K-8s, or we've talked a lot around separating into making sure all of our communities are represented. So if we went some K-8s, but not all K-8s, where do you put them? Is that introduced choice all over again? And a few of those things, I think, felt like a big leap for the team that was participating in FACT to go from where we are now all the way to this very different approach to the way that we were doing school. Was the overwhelming sentiment when I went back and reread all of the notes from all of those small groups who kept notes. And that was really kind of where it ended up, was just size of school, gap in ages between students, and then how do you do that in a district to provide some that are that way and some that aren't, and then switching back and forth and all of those pieces was just really concerning for the FACT team. And so our last question for this section is, what opportunities do you think will open up for our, oh, sorry.
Matt wants to
Oh,
jump in.
Matt's ready, okay. I can't see him.
And then I tried to log it back in and things like that, but I just came on at the end there. But I'd echo in our group, the discussion around K-8s, that was one of the models looked at. And within the survey, it was either you kind of really loved it or you really were like not liking it. And it really didn't get full support like some of the other configurations. Because I think some of it is if people lived it at some point in time in their life with their child, it was really supported. And if you didn't, it was just a little bit way out there to an extreme to go that route. And then the other piece was just if you had a few of them, it was like, how would that look? And then back into what part of the community would you put it into? How would you get equitable access? And just a lot of more questions came from it than answers. And I think that's in the end why it shied away from that.
Thank you. All right, so now our last question. What opportunities do you think will open for our learners if we were to go to a one high school community, one large comprehensive with a small project-based learning high school?
This is one of the main questions that I'm answering, and I think there could be a ton of opportunities to open up. This is where I had to honestly go back to the first question that we answered and really step back, because I was like, no, I don't want to do one high school. No. And then I looked back and I was like, honestly, I think a bunch of things could open. Throwing just some ideas out there. I'm in tennis. I'm starting my last season, like next week. We are open to Central and Hale. And through my 2 years fully, I've never had a Central girl come. I've never had her join. I've heard that one has joined my freshman year when I wasn't on the team, and she showed up for one practice and stopped. So that could be because she didn't feel welcomed, and I don't know why, because we totally would have welcomed a girl into our team. Or it's just weird because you don't know any of the Hale girls, and there's that one Central girl. I think that a lot of teams that don't play could, because there's more people joining, they feel more comfortable in that environment. With music, a lot of my music classes are being cut this year that I would have wanted to take for my senior year. I have a bunch of open credits I can take. I just have a bunch, but I can only take 2. With another example, one comprehensive could open up a bunch of more opportunities for kids to take classes. One of my friends, she's taking a class this year, and it's at Central, but she goes to Hale. So she's gonna have to travel back to Hale once she's done with that class. If it was just one high school, we could run so many new classes, have so many new just career like choices for kids to take, and it's all there. It's all one school, and there's so many more teachers that we could have then to use those roles for. I think that a lot of people just go automatically. It's gonna divide people. No, like, we don't want that. But think of like all, like, money aside, think of what we could do if all of our efforts was for one school. I think of other schools and I hear families go like, oh, we're open enrolling. Well, why? What are we doing wrong? Let's think about what we can do right and have so many career choices for kids to do and be that school where, like, yes, we are doing that because my child wants to go into A, B, and C, and those schools have A, B, and C. And let's bring those opportunities to them.
Jeff?
I just think it'd be a very good move because you would lessen administrative costs, you would have no teachers traveling, you would have no students traveling, as she mentioned, your arts programs, music, athletics, drama club, anything. It's gonna have more kind of, for those clubs, like, there's more internal competition, so that when you get out in the real competition, you're a little bit more prepared for it. It would be quite a change for the people in the city who since 1940 have had 2 high schools, but, you know, nothing stays the same.
Amy?
I would just reiterate what Amira said, and I mean, I think that there were some people on the committee who did have concerns about the size of one high school, but the opportunities I think that we could give to our learners would be so much greater. I think that's, you know, I was really concerned about equity based on where we would put this one big high school. But I think, you know, right now we struggle to even get, you know, junior varsity teams and varsity teams, and we don't even have freshman teams for a lot of our athletics. So I think that's gonna help out. I think in courses, you know, we're gonna be able to provide a lot more courses, a lot more, you know, maybe hopefully AP or other courses or things that the kids are interested in, because you're gonna have more kids in the classrooms. So I think that we should not focus so much when people brought up that concern about size necessarily, because again, like I said, I think, you know, one comprehensive high school is going to bring us so many more opportunities for our learners, and hopefully we can create some more partnerships and stuff within the community. Yeah.
Awesome. And Matt?
Echo many of these things, and like I said, being now at Hale for 12 years, it's just looking at the overall opportunities we give to kids with one comprehensive high school. Really, I think initially when people hear combined 2 schools, it means less opportunity for kids, because you're only gonna have like one of those or one of those, and it's gonna eliminate kids from participating. But because we don't have, for example, in like athletics, many 3-level teams out there, we're co-oping quite a bit right now. We don't have, you know, a freshman JV and a varsity in all the sports. It actually like build our program rather than reduce. Now, if both buildings had 3 of every level, that may be the case, but neither building does have that. And it hasn't been like that for a number of years. So it actually would build, you know, build program from an athletic standpoint. I'm looking at some of the co-curriculars as well. Can't really put together like a forensics team or a debate team, but I'm sure if we grab some of the students from current Hale and current Central, we could make a debate team and give kids an opportunity with that. But that isn't really given because the numbers aren't there by themselves. I look at, we are co-oping quite a few, like Amira said. And you know, I'm going down, we do things with each other through theater and tennis and swim and dive and gymnastics. There's in volleyball coming around the corner, and there's other questions about other activities and athletics. But the piece that, some of the pieces that I look at too as just, just want to give kids opportunities is that, yeah, you have to relook at things about building a robust intramural program then. Because some of you maybe were in high schools where, yeah, if you weren't on the XYZ team then you were in intramurals. And they had intramurals prior to, the Thursday night before game nights or whatever. And people would there'd be a league. And there'd be, so it's about how do you create opportunities, and the ones that maybe aren't about, how do you create additional opportunities? But that wasn't really the charge of this committee. It was like, what's the best for kids and opportunities around those things? And then it would be for the planning as you move forward. The size came up, but it's like, that's just another thing. Like, well, how do you deal with large environments? Well, you create smaller environments within larger environments. So there's a way to work through that. It's just a matter of putting people together and having conversations about what are the apprehensions, and then how do you move forward to give them, reduce that concern or something around the size of the school. Because you can always create smaller learning communities within a larger one. And then the piece that Amira said about the reduced numbers, like the number, if we aren't maybe at that 20 area to run a class doesn't run. And actually, if you put two comprehensive high schools into one, several of those classes may run then. And actually, keep that travel time, as my discussions were, we have kids go to Central for certain classes, and certain classes, Central students come to Hale. And often those are, some high-level classes that don't, college-level classes that don't run. And then what happens is those students then have to have an hour off for a study hall because they have to get back to their home school to take the rest of their day. But those are kids that want to take a full schedule. So you're trying to expand opportunity, and if it was in one large comprehensive high school, those opportunities would all be on one campus, wherever that campus is. And then I heard Mr. Sikich talk about less teacher travel, if there's shared staff between buildings and things like that. And I think that covered a lot of the different, so co-curricular, athletics, robust intramurals, get more kids involved, work through that large class size, but create smaller learning communities, which I think is in some of the design process, in that concept design that'll be talked about. And just more about the kids and keeping them in a location rather than having them travel all over to take classes back and forth and kind of manipulate their day. So those are all positives about going to one comprehensive high school.
Awesome. Well, that's the last of the questions we had for our FACT team members for this section. I think we're going to jump back into the thing you're probably the most excited about, which is some concepts and designs, and start looking at a few of those. And then we'll have another opportunity for our board to ask some more questions, whether it's of FACT team members or about some of the things you're about to see at the next section.
Excellent. Thank you, Deidre. Good evening. Matt Wolfert with Bray Architects. Good to see all of you again. We're going to advance right into the preliminary concept plans. And so as we went through in our last work session, the FACT committee did a great job evaluating a number of macro level district organization grade configuration studies. And as you learned tonight, they've landed on a recommendation for keeping our consistent grade configuration, targeting 8 elementary schools, 2 intermediate schools, 1 high school. So they've really built the framework. Now we have to begin exploring how do we actually adapt or reinvest in existing schools within the district to support that configuration. One of the things they also spent a fair amount of time on, or a goal of each of these, was, is there a way to create a predictable path for students and families in the district? And you think of 8 to 2 to 1 is a pretty predictable, pretty linear structure whereby you can give a really good sense when you enter an elementary school which intermediate school is going to be yours, and then obviously we'll all come together as a district in a singular high school. So I think that's where we're going to go this evening. We want to share with you the first one elementary school, I should say. We're not going to go through every one. We wanted to give you a representation of the effort that went into exploring what elementary schools could look like. It's critically important to note on all of these, and the note is there, it's critically important. These are just conceptual at this point. I sometimes wish we went back to hand drawing because it wouldn't look so refined and finished. This is far from a finished architectural product. It's done as a test fit to make sure that we can accomplish your academic goals, space goals, site goals at each of the schools, and allows Mark and the C.G. Schmidt team to prepare the preliminary budget information that he's going to share with you in a little while. So we picked Pershing as one example of a good elementary school to explore. When we looked at all of the schools, we were really looking for a capacity of about 480 students in what we would call a 3-section or a 3-classroom per grade level, 4-year-old kindergarten through 5th grade elementary school. We organized the buildings into houses, so when you'll see, we generally have 4-year-old kindergarten on its own, then we have kindergarten, 1st grade, 5K, and 1st grade grouped together, 2nd and 3rd and 4th and 5th grades grouped together, and I'll show you that a little bit more on the plans as we get into them. But as you can see on the site plan, this is really looking at a major addition to the north of the existing building, which would involve some additional hardscape playground, a parent drop-off pickup on the west side, some parking on the north, and then a small playground area on the east. So as we get into the floor plan, and again, these are very conceptual, but we would have on our main first floor, we would have our 4-year-old kindergarten classrooms. And can you see? You can't see my mouse, so this is going to be an interesting. I'll have to really use my ability to describe these plans. 4K classrooms are on the top of this plan, so you can see 3 4K classrooms lined up on the top of the plan, each with their own a single toilet attached to them. Small group instruction spaces. So I think, as we all know, there are, education is very different than it was when all of us sat in 30 desks facing a chalkboard, likely. So we have to accommodate different abilities to bring support to students, to bring intervention work to students. And so some of these rooms labeled SGI are small group instruction or small group learning environments, whereby a paraprofessional or a specialist can work with 1 to 5 students, again, generally within the confines of their area of the school. So again, bringing the services to students versus sending the students across the building for services. You can also see then across the hall the 5K and 1st grade classrooms, 3 of those lined up in the yellow. I should have started with this. The yellow is considered additions or new construction on each of the sites. The gray are existing areas of the school. And then the pinker color on the plan would be areas of major renovation. What doesn't show on a floor plan like this are the capital improvements. So as Mark spoke to last meeting, and we'll speak to again in a little while, all of the schools have some in areas of need in plumbing, HVAC, electrical systems, other things like that. Those don't show on a plan, but as you'll see in the budget, those will be represented. So this, as you can see, has 4K, 5K, and 1st grade on our main floor, along with a remodeled cafeteria. Each of the cafeterias, each of the schools, as we explored them, we're looking to provide an appropriately sized cafeteria so we can move students through in 3 lunch periods. We also wanted to have a separate art and music classroom, so those weren't going to be delivered on a cart. They weren't going to be delivered in undersized rooms, making sure that we can offer those important classes and coursework to our elementary students. Each school would have a sufficient secure entrance and office sequence. Each elementary school would have a 1-station gymnasium, that's 1 competition basketball court with reasonable clearances around it, and it would have a curtain that could drop in the middle to allow you to run a couple of Phi Ed classes at one time. So you can see that gymnasium in the upper right-hand corner of this plan. And then we move upstairs, you can see again our 2nd, 3rd grade classrooms and 4th and 5th grade classrooms. Those are supported by what are labeled as collab areas. So that is very similar to the small group instruction or small group learning environment. It's an opportunity for students and staff to break out into less defined and more flexible, more creative teaching and learning environments. And we ideally place them directly adjacent to classrooms so that educators have the ability to very easily transition into them, have the ability to supervise and see students and support staff members working with students there. And you can see those collabs spread throughout the 2nd floor, both in the addition and in the existing building through some renovated areas. And then the final piece you'll see on this floor is the IMC, or for many of us, the library. I can promise you it won't look like the libraries that we went to. Won't be wooden furniture that doesn't move, and it's gonna look like a very innovative, flexible, dynamic learning environment. Still about getting resources, books in students' hands, but really continuing to support the immersive education and project-based learning that they're gonna be receiving in each of the schools. So we picked Pershing as an example. All of the elementary schools that went through this exercise with exploring conceptual site and floor plans. I can promise you, if you told us go tomorrow, that the end result wouldn't look like this. We haven't had extensive staff engagement. We've, at the high level, know that we've checked all the boxes for spaces that we need, but there's still a lot of work to do from a time any of these projects would be approved until they would proceed. So that's an example of one elementary school. We'll do the same thing over at Frank Lloyd Wright at the intermediate side. So this would potentially be one of the 2 intermediate schools supporting the district. We would have about 800 students, 6th through 8th grade in each of these schools. Our goals would be to have 5 houses. So we would have roughly 5 classrooms, 4 classrooms, a science lab, some small group instruction spaces, a collaboration space, and a STEAM or flex area associated with each house. So 5 of those houses spread throughout the school. And you can see in the floor plan, what would end up happening here is really are looking at 2 major additions. One would be an addition for our band, choir, orchestra spaces, along with general music. You can see that in the lower right-hand corner of this plan. Each of the intermediate schools could potentially have an auditorium associated with it. So in this case, we're showing an auditorium positioned on the upper right-hand corner of the plan. The goals for intermediate schools were to have 2 competition-sized basketball courts or a 2-station gymnasium. It's not only needed for Phi Ed purposes, but all the other after-school activities and sports that we'd be offering for our middle school students or intermediate school students, sorry. And then a cafeteria that would be sized for 3 lunch periods again, so you can see that kind of in the core of the school in the middle. And then you can start to see what a conceptual house could look like. So you see in the lower left-hand corner of this plan, 4 classrooms, 2 small group instruction rooms, a science lab, a STEAM flex space across the hall from it, and then a collaboration space. You can imagine students really having a smaller school within a school experience whereby there are 800 students, but you really don't have to leave your house for things other than your exploratories of family and consumer science, band, gymnasium, et cetera. You really get your core instruction in a smaller school within the larger school environment. I will say at 800 students, that's not really considered a large intermediate school by statewide standards, but it might be a little different than you currently have. So really trying to make sure that we're providing the best educational opportunities for students as possible. And then we move upstairs, you can see 4 more basically, using renovation to create 4 more of our academic houses. Another general guiding principle is to provide natural light as much as possible, whenever possible to students. Research will obviously show you that natural light does have a positive impact, not only on student experience, but on academic outcome. And so we're gonna do our best when possible to carve and create natural light into all of the spaces that students are spending their day in. So again, the flavor of what an intermediate school project could be, trying to make sure that we have both schools with the same academic features to provide the same opportunities to students throughout the communities. And then finally, the most complex potential project in the group. It's critically important you see, this really is one unnamed comprehensive high school. This isn't Central High School, it's not Hale High School. It happens to be on the Hale site, and we'll show you a little later in the presentation why the FAC committee is leaning towards this in their recommendation, and it's probably apparent to most of you why. But we tested it to make sure, and you'll see that the central site, what this would really mean to create a comprehensive high school there shortly. But what this plan looks at is actually basically, again, yellow is new construction. We would have some new parking along the west side of the stadium. The main event entry and school entry would be on the south side, so basically adjacent to the angled piece that's reaching out on the lower right-hand side of the building plan. One thing that's probably easy to see here too is this was unintentional, but it was a potential benefit. It just happened as the architectural solution really came about, is the entire existing building happened to become wrapped in new construction. So it really is gonna look, and for all intents and purposes from the outside, like a new school, even though we are going to take advantage of as much of the existing building as possible through renovation and reinvestment to support students. So it was interesting as we created this, the architects think in terms of philosophies, and really we obviously have an urban street grid with some pretty predominant angular components and dirt roads that cut through town. So that is actually part of, and it's supported by parks and green spaces throughout. And so you'll see when we get into the floor plan, this quick diagrammatic exercise of the urban street grid concept with parks and generally 90-degree streets, but some cutting angularly through, really influence the overall direction of this floor plan. So the first floor, again, the areas in yellow are the additions. So you can see this is predominantly a lot of additions. And I will say right now that this is more space than we need. We actually ended up over-designing in terms of square footage, which is a positive. Much easier to scale back, much easier to make sure we'd be more than happy having more land available for parking and other amenities. So this is not what a final 2,000 student solution would look like, but the positive, it's more space than we need. One of the biggest challenges of the current high school on this site, and those of you that have been in it know, is that center section, which is currently shown as being demolished and being rebuilt as cafeteria and servery. That is the auditorium, the band, choir, orchestra spaces. We have a variety of floor levels. Our rooms are smaller. It's a pretty challenging space, and it didn't programmatically meet the needs of what a 2,000 student high school would potentially have. So in this proposal, that section of the school down the center would be removed and would be replaced with new construction of the cafeteria and commons. And just as we talked about on the new middle schools, we really are looking to create semi-schools within schools. These would be generally referred to more as learning communities. This would provide you with a great deal of flexibility, not only today, but decades into the future as to how you organize the school. Do you want to organize by departments? Do you want all of our math and English and social studies to be together? Do you want to create interdisciplinary delivery teams whereby you might have one English, one social studies, one math, one science instructor working together? Each of these learning communities would have a STEAM area. That could be a science lab, it could be a project-based learning lab, it could be a flexible environment with makerspace type features of printers and engravers, anything you can think of. But think of that as kind of our science component within these learning communities. And each of the learning communities would be surrounding a learning common, outdoor green space. It's a courtyard technically, wouldn't have to be green because we understand how difficult those can be to maintain. But the goal again is to drive natural light deep into all of the spaces within the building, but also provide an internal, safe educational environment. Students aren't going out on campus, they're inside the building, but they get access to the outside for some teaching and learning opportunities. So you can generally see along the lower left-hand side, wrapping up the left-hand side of the plan, and north is left in this plan, on this image. So wrapping along the left-hand side of this plan, and then also remodeling a fair amount of the existing building would be those learning communities on 2 floors. Along the top of this plan, which would be the east side of the site, are our career tech ed spaces. So our autos, our woods, our metals, our welding, manufacturing, all those critically important academic career tech components. And then as we move across the school to the right side of the plan on the screen, or the south side of the plan, we'd be keeping the 2 gymnasiums, building some new locker rooms, adding a 3-court gymnasium or field house with seating for between around 2,000 to 2,500 in that space. The option to add a pool as well. And then you'd have the large event lobby that would be supporting. So the majority of the parking is on the south side or the right side of this plan. You would have an event lobby that would serve your field house, would serve your pool, would serve your existing gymnasiums. And then it would also support an 800-seat theater or performing arts center that is supported by our band, choir, orchestra spaces on the bottom right-hand side of this plan. So you can see organizationally how this works. Generally, our academics are concentrated on the left side of the plan and on the east side of the plan. You could envision all of your evening and weekend activities really having their own event space. The rest of the academic areas could basically be locked off and not have to be heated and cooled and cleaned repeatedly. So we think the building really zones itself pretty effectively as well for your evening and weekend uses. Second floor of that plan, generally academic space, so a library at the core, but then a number of additional learning communities again. One of the benefits of the technology is you can go to third dimension pretty quickly. So we took this and kind of created a little axonometric view that gives you just a little bit of a better sense, just not in simple floor plan view, what the different spaces could start to look like, how they could organize themselves, how they connect to the outdoor learning community spaces, how that green space really becomes a huge part of the internal experience of a student. Every time they're moving, not only through a classroom, but they're in class, they're gonna have natural light either directly into their space or borrowed from across a simple hallway. And then again, tried to diagram out even just a little bit further, how could that possibly work in the existing building? Not quite as easy as when you're starting from scratch, but you can see here how an interdisciplinary learning community could work, anchored by science on the bottom. You can see math in blue, literacy in yellow, social studies, and I think that's a pink color again. World language could potentially be infused into a learning community. So seeing a ton of flexibility in this plan in terms of how it could, again, not only serve you today, but would really have the flexibility to adapt to a lot of different delivery models as the decades evolve, if this is your one comprehensive high school. So with that, that is the presentation on the fact recommendation.
So with that small bit of information, we're going to take about 10 minutes for you guys to have just a bit of a discussion around what surprised you about that information that was presented. What are you still wondering about? What are some of the questions that you have, either for our fact team members? Matt had to go to a football meeting, but to our fact team members that are here, as well as to anybody in the group around some of the things that you've seen so far tonight. Yeah, go ahead, Kristen.
All right, 2 questions. One question was the collaboration areas. My school calls them people pockets. Is it built into the budget for the furniture that'll be anticipated for those spaces?
Yes.
Okay, and then if I'm looking at the very last slide you just did, page 31, are those lockers in the middle of the hallway?
Yeah, so these would be locker bays. What we've seen is, I guess, 2 trends in lockers at the high school level. One, they don't use them, and so we're putting far fewer lockers in. Sometimes as small as 50% of the capacity of the school would be the quantity of lockers. And then we're not lining them down hallways anymore because they're more of a destination. A student's gonna go there every 3rd period, or they might only go to their locker at the beginning of the day and the end of their day, given we're not lugging as many textbooks around, and a lot of reasons for that. So instead of them needing to be directly adjacent to every student movement, they should still be convenient, but they don't have to be the traditional sense of lined up along the hallways.
Because I'm looking at this as I'm a teacher, so immediately my first thought was I don't have sight of distance down the hall for student safety, so,
When they're using the lockers potentially?
yeah.
Yeah, and that's an operational consideration. In some cases, there would be on the lower side of this image, there would be theoretically windows where a classroom teacher could be observing through a window what's happening there. Otherwise, it becomes an operational consideration that somebody's assigned to simply step out and supervise during given periods. So this is a pretty tried and true move now away from linear lockers to locker bays. Where they go, how they're supervised, heights of them, quantities of them, all of those details have to be worked out, and supervision is absolutely a piece of making these work.
Other questions that people have? Yeah, Heather?
It just seemed to me that everyone focused on the extracurriculars versus the actual day-to-day operation in one high school. Because a lot of that we already do. We already have the collaboration in our music and arts. We already have co-op sports. So my concern is more of the day-to-day operation within the school day, not the extracurriculars, because we already co-op a lot of that. Just because we have one comprehensive high school doesn't mean we're necessarily gonna have all those classes that we're kind of telling people we're gonna guarantee, but we're really not. Because just because you're one comprehensive high school, if you have 7 and 7, that's still 14, we're not running a program for 20. So have we considered that? Like, if we have one comprehensive high school, we have a class that 14 kids want, and we need 20 to run the program, are we gonna offer them an opportunity to go to a college to take that course? And that still presents the same, they're still traveling, they're still having missed courses. How are we going to address that?
Well, a couple of things. When we look at the number of courses that we aren't offering right now, because the numbers really do sit at that 14 kind of
Yep.
number, right? So we'll have 14 students at one of our comprehensive high schools, 10 students at the other. It's not fiscally responsible, and frequently if there's specialty courses, it's access to an instructor to run a course at either comprehensive high school. So then they tend not to run. But you put those two groups of students together, you have 21, that's within the range of what's fiscally responsible to run a course, and then you're really only looking for one expert instructor at that time. We were able to do some things during virtual instruction, actually, because we could combine some things for the two high schools to keep some of those upper level classes going that don't always get to running. Right? Because in virtual, it didn't matter where you were physically located. So we're trying to model some of what we're doing next off of some of that. Could we have students virtually zoom into a different school? We anticipate being able to offer, if we just had to make that decision this year, it's about half the courses that we would have had to cut that we'd automatically get to offer. The other challenge is, as we talked about the feeders, so elementaries into intermediate into high school, with that being so much more of a predictable pattern under this, you get that opportunity to really grow a program. And that's true about your co-curriculars as well as your academic programs. So as we start things around computer science and much earlier grades, and you know exactly what you're feeding into, that becomes so much more clarity and that many more students taking some of those opportunities. As we work really hard at doing some of the cross-curricular work, the options get bigger and bigger and bigger. We'll have more teachers who are able to do more things because they're doing them collectively within groups, and then adding them to these environments. Just the number of things that, with all the staff in one place, we would be able to offer, as we looked back, many more courses that we weren't able to offer this year. And we can never guarantee to the community this is exactly what we'll offer, what will not, because that's going to change year to year based on the students and the interests that they have. We staff based on the course requests that we get. So we don't say, okay, you get so many career and tech ed teachers and so many business teachers. We say, what were the requests from students that came in to take those courses? And then we staff from that. So the more we can grow our district programming and our district feeding into the programs that we want to make sure we're offering, the easier it's going to be to say we'll have enough students choosing that to be able to offer it. And then there are programs like Early College Now and several other programs that, of course, we participate in across the state that do allow for some of those opportunities. Now, those come when we can't offer the next level of the course. Frequently, that's because of licensure, that then you offer the chance to go take it at a local university or local college, and then there's reimbursement and all of that good stuff. But you're right, it's transportation too. It's transportation back. It's a lot on the family to participate in some of those things as well. So there are no guarantees, but that was a big part of our discussion. Is Aaron Norris was from our school services department, was also on the FAC team. So he was able to say, hey, here's the number of courses we weren't able to run this year. But had we had combined, we would have run, approximately half of them or some numbers like that. And so there are quite a few more of those chances and opportunities than most of the group talked about. It's sort of the sports and the co-curriculars that tend to attract that attention, but the coursework really will be able to adjust with that many students choosing that many courses, and then also the work we've done over the last couple of years to refine the course catalog so it's not so extensive. Right, when it has too many choices in it, we have too many students spreading out their choices, and then we can't get at the coursework that we really want to make sure help our students be ready for life when they're done with school. Amy?
I just wanted to add on to what Heather was saying. The other thing too, just to remember, is that I think sometimes when we think of co-curriculars, we automatically think of athletics. I think that one of the things that's the thing I kept thinking about. But I think if we have one comprehensive high school, we also have an opportunity to provide more of those club-type curriculars and activities. So, I didn't even realize that Hale doesn't even have a newspaper. Well, maybe if we have this new comprehensive high school and somebody's interested in media arts or something, that's something that we could do during the school day and maybe even incorporate with coursework, that type of stuff. So I think that in the everyday kind of stuff, I think it would allow us to incorporate more or allow, you know, us to, over lunch hours and stuff, to have more maybe activities available for kids, not just athletics, after-school type stuff.
On the flip side of that, my concern would be that right now we have kids that would normally not try a sport or an extracurricular because it's, guess what, there's only 6 kids versus 20 kids. So I have an opportunity to try something I've never tried before. So you might be taking away an opportunity from a kid who's, but this is my thought, right? So this is where I'm coming from, someone who is not great at basketball wants an opportunity to try it. So, you know, you have your freshman, your JV, your varsity, but you have a kid who, I'm not quite good enough, we only have 13, now you have 40 kids try out, or 20 kids try out, 7 kids just lost an opportunity where they would have had an opportunity before. So,
But-
you know, and I know, I'm just playing devil's advocate, I'm just throwing it out there. I mean, you see these kids who, and you hear it all the time, a kid who was never that good, who goes on to be a pro. So I don't wanna cut that opportunity for a kid who might blossom later. So that's my concern.
Bill?
You know, I don't wanna get in a big argument about it, but how many opportunities are we cutting when Central doesn't have a football team this year?
Yeah,
You
so-
know.
and Matt mentioned something related to this, is the idea of intramurals.
Yep.
That you, and I think I've told this story to a number of you, that where I went to high school, so I played basketball, I ran track, so I had a winter sport and a spring sport. If you weren't in an organized sport in a season, you had to play intramurals. And so in the fall, I played flag football. And where I had the most fun in athletics was in the fall. I just loved the intramural experience, and there were leagues and there were championships, and you had to stay active is what they were really trying to accomplish. So having more kids in one place where we have the right facilities to support that, I think starts to be a realization in one location. I get your point, Heather, that, right, so, right, is it limit opportunities for some kids, but I think we're doing that right now, and I don't think it's intentional that we're doing that, but it's happening, and I think solving that in one place, I think, is more likely than continuing to do what we're doing now.
Bill?
So I just wanna talk about the way I view it. I view it as a point of competition, you know, not just athletically. We're competing, our kids are competing for positions in careers and in the world and for the rest of their lives. And getting into colleges and providing these different opportunities for these kids. And right now, what we've been doing has been great for our community to have 2 separate high schools and say, I have had this Hale community, I've had this Central community, but are we providing our kids with the best opportunity to be those kids that are picked? You look at the top school districts in the state of Wisconsin, and you look at their facilities, you look at what they provide their kids. And you look at what we provide at Hale and Central, and we're at the bottom always. We're always at the bottom. And what's gonna change? How are we gonna change that? We're competing for teachers. We're competing for businesses to come into our community and partner with us. We're just not gonna say, hey, we want this to happen. We want these, to come in here and compete and do this, but not do anything about it. And that's what we've been doing. And this is an opportunity to provide for our kids and the kids beyond our kids and our kids' kids and their kids an opportunity to be on a competitive playing field in all aspects of what they do. Every aspect, science, athletics, drama, everything. You don't have to go to Sussex Hamilton and have a income of $400,000 to be able to be selected to go to Madison. You can be at West Dallas. We don't need 1,000 families transferring out of our district because we're not providing them with those opportunities. They can stay and be on a competitive playing field, even maybe a better playing field, because we're gonna provide our kids with the best, okay? Instead of half the best over here, half the best over there, we're done with that. It hasn't worked, in my opinion, as a whole. So we need to think about doing this. It's not about co-curriculars. It's about what's best for our kids at the end of the day. And what's best for our community. And right now, when people say stuff about West Dallas, they don't say a lot of great things. So if we provide that perspective to change, our city's providing that perspective and changing that perspective. So our school district, we should provide that perspective and go right along with it. And that's my opinion.
Brian?
So here's my thought / concern, and I'm coming from a background where I was initially very much in favor of keeping 2 high schools. After evaluating and kind of looking at everything, I see all the benefits of doing 1 high school. My main concern, and I know that there's very little that we can do about it, is the location. I am very concerned that our only high school being far on the west side of town, when you consider the socioeconomic status of many of the people in our district, I'm afraid of what that extra transportation piece is going to do. And going back to the increased opportunities of some of the co-curriculars and even some of the classes and everything else, in those cases, anything you're doing after school, you have to find your own way home. And when you're talking about kids that used to be able to walk from Central, maybe a few blocks to their house, now they don't have that option. And depending on, what their family life is and what types of shifts their parents work, I am afraid that in some cases we will be taking opportunities away. And again, I understand that our options are limited, but I think that is a very realistic concern that we do need to consider.
And that certainly came up quite a few times with the FACT team, right? If we, in an ideal world, we could simply pick up what we already have to work with and move it to the center of our community. That would be ideal, but that's not realistic in what we have to work with right now. And when you see some of what it would look like to create 1 comprehensive high school at the current location that has Central's school on it, you'll see where some of that just doesn't make a lot of sense just because of the natural square footage in that area, because of the district-owned property in that area. We talked quite a bit about knowing that that's an increased cost when you talk about transportation. But remember, one of the charges was of the FACT team as well was to make sure that we are not running more square footage than we need. And we're currently running Central with 1,000 students in it. And what's the capacity? I don't know that one off the top of my head.
Far more than 1,000.
Far more than 1,000. Good answer, Matt. So far more than 1,000. So it's inefficient in its current functioning, and it would be quite the challenge with some of the CIP challenges to think about what's better not only for our learners every day, because I'm with Bill. We move proudly into this community because I'm proud of the work we do in our schools for my own children. But we need to keep increasing those opportunities for kids, but we also need to be fiscally responsible to our community, and continuing to run at the level that we have, some of what we've done is a challenge. But yes, we've talked about traffic flow, where that would go. We've talked about increased transportation costs. We've talked about running activity buses so that students can stay after school and participate in more evening events. So there's a lot of those pieces that have been part of the discussion. So when we look at the long-term plan and where this parts of investing then become a cost savings, some of the, obviously that's not going to be apples for apples in any way, shape, or form, but it does allow us to say, okay, what could we do with some of the, not doing some of the CIP work that's out there, or not having to run some of the electric and the additional staffing that some additional buildings take. And it would be to open access, because we would need to.
Yeah, that's great, and that's
Yeah.
what I'd like to see is some strategic thinking behind what we can do to address that population that might have some of those challenges so that they can be included and involved.
Yep, yeah, and that was, again, a big concern for the team and a big part of our discussions as well. I saw Bill and then Kristen.
I was just saying, with it, what you're saying is maybe that opens our mind to outside the box thinking on transportation. How does that transportation change in 3 to 5 years? How does streamlining and being 8 school elementary, 2 intermediate, 1 high school change our transportation needs? And maybe we run our own, we run our own transportation. Maybe that's more instead of contracting.
Heather, it's okay.
It's way more expensive. It's way more expensive to own your own fleet. Trust me, you don't want to be fixing buses and storing them and all that other stuff.
Yeah.
But I envision some kind of Uber app pickup type service for kids after school. How do you run vans, short, smaller conversion van type things? Why can't a kid can get on his phone and look at Snapchat, but why can't a kid get on his phone, go to the West Dallas School District app and pick up at this place at this time, I'll be there.
Sounds like a co-curricular opportunity.
Sounds like a
When you
design
know that
opportunity for
route's
one of our
picking
high
up
schools.
52 kids in a, however that looks, so I think there's some really cool, probably outside the box things we can maybe do.
For sure.
Kristen?
I'm just wondering, was Frank Lloyd Wright ever in discussion as a option?
To create a high school on
Yeah.
the Frank Lloyd Wright campus?
Yeah, I don't know that we ever explored it in terms of an actual architectural solution. It could be potentially, but the thought was with the investment in some of the outdoor facilities that exist at the Hale site currently, and some of the existing infrastructure at Hale as a high school potential building, made a little bit more sense. But there's no reason that we couldn't explore other options if the board would like.
But it would still be on the west end, so it wouldn't solve our problem of having it more centrally located.
It's a couple miles
But it'd be
closer.
closer.
It's closer to
A little
Central.
Couple
closer.
miles closer.
Yeah, you're right.
Because my kids are gonna go to Central, well, whatever we decide here. But my kids are, Mitchell, Frank Lloyd Wright, Central. So going to Frank Lloyd Wright, it's really not that much further that way, and it's a little more centralized. I'm just throwing it out there.
Yeah, and again, remember, not that we can't consider anything, but how much movement and displacement and all of those pieces are you doing with it? And that is also a consideration, although this does have quite a bit of that over the next couple of years.
Yeah.
No?
Does everyone else have any other questions before I ask my questions?
I just have one. Has there consideration for the amount of green space lost at Hale by building out on it? How can you expand? Because there's going to be a lot of green space lost there. I don't imagine the city being very happy about that, even if it is just expanding a school.
Yep, and good question. The basic answer is the only, I'll say, function that we've really displaced is tennis in the
Okay.
current concept. And we're exploring a variety of ways to answer the tennis question in terms of where those courts go. There's options in the neighborhood potentially. You'll see an option at Central Site where we could recreate some outdoor athletic opportunities to support some of those programs. So we were very careful not to displace any function. Correct me if I'm wrong, I don't believe the solution as currently proposed displaces any usable green space with the exception of that tennis piece.
Yeah, and the other, Steve and I met with City of West Allis Department of Development, and we also raised just really high-level conversations about this, and they're interested in stormwater runoff and all of those things, right? But we also talked about there's the open land behind the police station, right? Some of it is the dog park now, but that's also land that's been in discussion over years of whether that was going to be more athletic fields for soccer. So it's already been kind of thought of. And that's not been considered in the one comprehensive high school model at this point, just because we wanted to talk to them just before we start putting it out in kind of public conversation. But at least those discussions are engaged now.
Okay, Noah?
My questions are a little bit more, I guess, higher level than some of the specifics that we've discussed already. In the one high school drawing, the concept, the current pool at Hale would be removed, and then we're looking, is that correct? And then
Correct.
there was, you said possibly a pool that would be added, so is the money that we're gonna look at here in a little bit consider in putting and building a new pool?
Yes, it does.
Okay. And would that pool be the same size, bigger or smaller than the current pool we have?
It would be larger. I can give you the specifics. It would be, I get my meters in yards wrong, so I want to make sure I tell you correctly. A 25-meter pool with 8 lanes and then 15 feet of deck space around it.
Okay, and that would still qualify for any WIA events that we'd be hosting?
Yeah, the WIA really, the meters are fine, the 8 lanes are fine. It's really the seating capacity that's the issue. And until Waukesha South goes away, it's going to be harder to host some of the really big events in southeastern Wisconsin because of their seating capacity. But for the majority of your dual and conference type meets, this would be a fantastic pool for that.
Okay, I just want to make sure you wouldn't lose that opportunity off of our current pool.
Can I interrupt for a minute? Is that keeping the present diving well?
No, the pool goes away. I think, does it get remodeled to become a weight fitness center or, I believe?
So there would be no diving well?
The diving would be as part of the pool vessel itself.
So it'd be more like Central's pool?
Yeah, even bigger than that. But
Okay.
yeah, the concept of diving in a portion of an
Of their pool.
8-lane pool.
Mhm.
Okay. other question I had was, so by combining the high schools, and I'm ignorant on the size requirements for the different divisions that we compete in, but we have to shift divisions by increasing our two high schools together. And would that change I mean, right now we struggle to compete in the divisions we are in. So by combining together, would that then make the competition even higher level for us to be able to try and compete?
Well, right now, Hale is in the Greater Metro Conference and Central is in the Woodlands Conference.
Yep.
And so the first determination for a conference is by size. So by this size, combining size, most likely we would end up in the Greater Metro. So we'd still be in the same level of competition that Central was in 3 years ago and Hale is still currently in. The WIA does take into consideration the percent of the students that you serve that qualify for free and reduced lunch, because sometimes there's not those external opportunities for athletics for some of those families. And that's where we were able to make the shift to one of our high schools going into the Woodlands Conference. But the likelihood, and working with the WIAA is somewhat complicated, but the likelihood is we'd stay in the Greater Metro Conference then for our one high school concept.
Okay, all right. And then, the last question I had, and this is the biggest one that I have, and maybe this is for our last meeting, I don't know. But, how was the board going to decide which buildings that were going to idle? And are we going to see some information that would provide us with that ability to try to make some of those decisions? Because I really think that at the crux of it, that's gonna make a big difference in the community. And so I think that, that information for me is, you know, tantamount to trying to be able to figure out what path that we go down. Because I think the buildings that we idle will somewhat dictate somewhat of the paths that we go down.
Yeah, and you will see tonight the intermediate solution and the high school solution have kind of laid out Lane and Central potentially as whether they're idle, whether they're repurposed, that's all up in the air. But you will see in the next few slides that Lane is not an intermediate school that we're currently exploring as one of the two. And Central, again, we mentioned a couple times, we'll show you in a minute, we've explored it in detail. There's an opportunity for that to become an athletic facility potentially for the community and for the district. So those would be two that are known. Elementary schools, we've begun looking at different options. I have not, I don't think, and Marty and Deidre, please correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think we've landed any kind of concrete definitive direction there yet. And part of it is gonna be after tonight, and we're jumping to Bill's piece of the presentation, the survey strategy. You may decide, if we decide to survey about the high school and intermediate first and the elementary later, maybe we're just upfront that we're gonna close some elementary schools or consolidate some elementary schools, but we don't have to go into the weeds on every last detail of which one and when and timing and boundaries and all the pieces that come with that. That can become a discussion that happens after. For what it's worth, that's how Neenah has handled theirs. They're building a new high school. They're moving their 5th through 8th grade students into their current high school. So they knew they were closing a middle school, but they're actually consolidating from 8 to 5 or 6 elementary schools. And that referendum passed a year ago, and they're just now getting around to those community conversations around elementary schools. One example.
So
Not saying it's the right example. But.
Yeah, the big charge for the board, for our board next steps, is the survey. You're really deciding on the community survey and then what's the strategy that we use within the community survey, because that's also gonna tell our board a ton of information around taking some next steps. And so, but you can't send out a survey to that broader community that's so broad that it doesn't help us get any specific information upon which we can take action. And so that's kind of leading up into the rest of the conversation tonight and our last session around just getting down to kind of how do you go from where the conversations we're having right now to our next action steps.
Okay, that's all I have for now. Anyone else have anything else before we move on?
So we'll move to the reality check portion of tonight's presentation. I'll turn it over to Mark. Thanks, Matt.
This is where we're in trouble. And then some.
All right, I'm gonna run through quickly how we put the budgets together, what's all in our budget numbers, and then the specific budgets for some of the schools that we've talked about already tonight, as well as a few other ones that we didn't present earlier. So So we start our budget takeoffs by taking the drawings that we get from Bray, and we break it into the different components with the additions, separating that into the different types of additions that we have, because there's a different cost to be applied to each one of those. And then we look at the remodeling piece, and we break that into a light remodel, a medium remodel, and a heavy remodel, and we apply a different cost for each one of those. So we worked really hard with the Bray team and with the district to identify the level of renovation in some of those spaces. You'll see on some of the, on the slides for the specific schools, this piece, this is two pie charts. They're the same thing, or they're all related to square footage. And so we identify the square footage of the proposed school. We've identified the building additions. Some of it is existing to remain space that we're not touching, and then the renovation. And then we have a separate pie chart to the right there that just really identifies the makeup of the renovation, and that can drive the cost. So if you see a lot more heavy remodel, and I'll show you some pictures of what that looks like here in a second, it kind of, you get a sense of how extensive the renovation work is going to be in each school. So here's a picture, an example of what a light remodel would look like. It's refreshing an existing space. It's putting in a new ceiling, painting the walls, new carpeting. We're reusing the LED lights that were already invested by the district in this scenario. So it's like a refresh. On the other side is a heavy remodel, and this is a complete gut and remodel. So we're taking down walls, we're putting up, reconfiguring things completely differently. All new mechanical, electrical, still reusing those light fixtures where we can, new plumbing, and then all new finishes. So this is on the other side. In between is a little bit of the gray area. That's the medium. So we might have some millwork associated with that that's moving around, minor walls that are moving, doors that are moving in different locations to kind of get you in that middle range. But that's how we look at putting together a budget at this stage where we have rectangles on a piece of paper. When we go through the next slides, in addition to the square footage, we have the cost. And so we have, in this section, the CIP only. So just for reference for each one of the schools, we put what the CIP cost is, and that is the bare minimum, or that's what's required just to keep that school in operation, which we talked about a couple of weeks ago. Over to the right here, we have the construction cost, and that is taking those square footages that we just went through, applying historical cost information from recent relevant schools that we've completed, and then looking at each individual site and seeing how we need to add or deduct from our historical information to make it site-specific. But it also includes escalation, and we're including normal escalation, all right? There's hyper escalation that's occurring right now. If you bought a 2x4 3 months ago, you're probably mad because you can buy it for less now, but it's still more than 6 months ago. So we're assuming that everything is in 2023 pricing, and that is, we're assuming normal, kind of typical escalation, things that will be back to what we would anticipate at that time. And why we're saying 2023 is, hypothetically, if you go to a referendum in April of 22, it'll take a year for the drawings to be complete, and maybe more, depends on which options are investigated or that you go down. So we'll be buying the project in 2023 dollars, and that's what we've included here. We've also included contingency. As Matt said, the things are going to change as the design and options are looked at. So we have a construction contingency included in our number that is typical at this phase of budgeting. We've also, Matt talked about this earlier, so there are still some CIP costs that are associated with each one of these scenarios. Roof replacements, looking at the exterior, updating windows, masonry, tuck pointing, parking lots. So we really scrubbed that big book, and Steve had his here, of like what's left, what didn't we address by putting these, looking at the additions and the renovation stuff. So that's what's, that piece right there, yeah. So there's still some items in there that are associated with each one of these scenarios. We wanted to make sure that we included in the budget that we put together. There's also, for every school, the hazardous materials, so that's the abatement, the lead abatement, and other things that are required to do the renovation. So we just identified that as a separate piece for every school. And then soft costs. So Kristen, you had asked about furniture, right? So that's where the furniture falls in. And I want to spend a few minutes kind of going through the soft costs. There's quite a few lines that are associated with that. So in addition to construction, there are other costs associated with project, and we call it the total project budget. The first area where you could see some soft costs are the site analysis and acquisition costs. So there could be site surveying, material testing, soils analysis, making sure that we understand what's out there before we start digging. There's the consultant costs, so the design and engineering costs associated with the school. An owner contingency, so it's important that once everything gets dialed in, that there's still an owner contingency for changes that can occur along the way from a construction standpoint or some of these other budget items that are being held by the district. There's low voltage and head-end equipment, so all the AV, security, fire alarm systems, there's kitchen equipment, things all fall into this bucket. IT and communication cabling, so this is all the cabling pieces, the paging phones, Wi-Fi, which is very important to make the app work for the students to be picked up after school, which is a very innovative idea, by the way. Furnishings and equipment, so this is another one of the big ones. This is where all the furniture falls in, and that is a big cost of some of this new renovation and addition work. Development and soft costs, so sometimes there are state review fees, building permits, temporary power. We're tying into an existing building and going off the existing electrical, so electrical bills are a little bit higher there, and other items like that. And then occupancy, we could have some commissioning or other items that were have costs associated with them. Sorry, I'm trying to pick up some time here. And the last thing is project financing costs. So there's appraisals, bond financing, and legal fees. So there's a lot of other stuff to summarize that goes into a project besides the construction. And we've accounted for that in our budgets that we put together here based on our experience working with other districts and other projects. So next I'm going to run through some of the specific projects that we've talked about today. Pershing Elementary, if you can see here, from a remodeling standpoint or square footage standpoint, when we're done, this will be an 89,300 square foot building. About half of the project is an addition, and half of it is renovating the existing building. You can see the renovation is primarily, a lot of it is heavy, almost 2/3, a little bit of medium, and the remaining is light. From a budget standpoint, the CIP cost is listed in the left-hand corner. That's was $5.6 million, but the cost to do what is shown on here totals $25.6 million. And all the elementary schools that we looked at, that's kind of the range that you get into, just to try to give you an idea of what each one of these looks like. We also, for every school that we budgeted, looked at a potential phased approach, and that was, what if we were to do an addition on the building and not do all of the renovation to begin with, and that could be done later on. So when we show you some of these numbers, you'll see a low end and a high end. The high end is the complete project with the additions, and the low end would be more of a phased approach. So the next slide here is just a summary of all of the elementary schools organized alphabetically. We have the CIP column on the left-hand side, And we just identified the purging, with the low end being 24 million and on the high end, 25.6. One of the things that we did when we looked at the low end is that we increased the CIP cost in that scenario. So if you're gonna defer building out and renovating that space, there's still some CIP costs that we're gonna have to address, and we incorporated that. In this one scenario, these two numbers are a little bit closer, and it kind of helps guide maybe further discussions of, well, maybe it might make sense in this scenario to go with the high end as opposed to trying to do a phased approach. But some of the other schools, there's more of a gap there. Next up, we're gonna run through the intermediate schools, and we're starting with Frank Lloyd Wright. So square footage is now intermediate are almost double that of the elementary schools. Frank Lloyd Wright has almost 205,000 square feet. There's 30,000 square feet of existing to remain, 28,000 square feet of additions, and the rest is renovating. And then when you look to the right of that renovating piece, which was 146,000 square feet, 124 of that is heavy remodel. So there's a lot of renovation that is proposed in this plan, heavy renovation. The budget makeup for this option is $52.3 million. So the next one we're going to talk about is West Milwaukee Intermediate.
So very briefly on West Milwaukee, similar to Frank Lloyd Wright with renovations and additions, this would be a two-story addition on the north side of the school with a new secure entry and offices on the lower level, along with our CTE, band, choir, orchestra spaces on the lower level. And then a level above that on the main first floor would be a new gymnasium, locker rooms, and other support spaces. So very similar, or I shouldn't even say that, basically identical in terms of actual quantities of spaces and types of spaces, just a different solution, of course, because it's a different building and a different site.
From a cost standpoint, the overall square footage is very similar. When you look at the amount of renovation in this building, it's less than Frank Lloyd Wright, and the type of renovation is not as extensive. And so the cost for West Milwaukee came in a little bit less than Frank Lloyd Wright at $49.1 million. So a summary of the two schools, the two intermediate schools, we have the CIP costs listed on the left-hand side. We have a low end, and so we didn't show you that option, but there is, if we were to do potentially a phased approach of getting the additions on the buildings, on the schools, and limiting the interior renovation to begin with, provided what that could look like, and then the high end, which we just reviewed. From a high school standpoint, we're going up again in square footage, so we're more than doubling from the intermediate school. So the one high school option that Matt presented earlier on the Nathan Hale site is 560,000 square feet. And what's interesting is when you look at this, the little renovation remodeling circle to the right, it's completely all heavy remodel, right? So this is all new on the exterior. This is gutting and remodeling the existing to come up with this plan. And the total cost for this is $180 million. Next up is the one comprehensive high school on the central site.
So very briefly, and we mentioned this a couple times, we took seriously what is the right site, and Central is obviously a potential opportunity given that it's an asset of the districts, and the location, as was mentioned by a number of people, might be more beneficial to many in the community. But I think, as you probably all could guess, constructing a 2,000 student high school on that site with its limited footprint, it really became the biggest inhibitor to success. It's doable. It involves a multi-story addition on the east end, a 5-story academic addition in generally a residential neighborhood on the center of the building, east of the field house and west of the existing school, and then an additional multi-story additions on the west end of the school. So you can see there's basically no usable green space left on this parcel when done. In addition to that, we would also be looking at a two-story parking structure south of Lincoln. So again, not intentionally making this overly complicated. It's just really limiting with the very small site that we do own here to make a high school for 2,000 students successful.
Okay. So from a cost standpoint, square footage wise, we're very similar to the one high school at the Nathan Hale at 565,000 square feet. Similar to the other one that we just looked at, all of the renovation is heavy renovation, but having a parking structure, a two-story parking structure, and some of the other things that Matt talked about does make this site more expensive at $205 million.
The next piece is, you had, as a board, asked a couple of times, what happens if we idle some schools? What could happen with those? One example we explored here at Central Site would be, what if we kept this site and certain aspects of the building, mainly the pool, locker rooms, and field house, as an athletic amenity, not only for the school district, but the broader community to use. As you can see here, the dashed line, the white dashed line on the right, is the existing building footprint, and that would actually be the majority of the academic spaces would be demolished. We'd be able to create some parking on the northeast side of the site, create a competition green space or field on the east side, and then we'd be able to construct tennis courts west of the school. The parking structure could or could not be built. That would be a decision to be made down the road. Whether you would want to invest in that for parking here. But this is just one quick example to show what it could mean to keep the athletic aspects and recreation aspects of the central site as part of your long-term plan.
So in this scenario, we ended up with a building that was 97,000 square feet. Mix of heavy, medium, and light renovation. And then with the parking garage, as part of that component, it ended up at $53 million. So the last slide that I have from a budget standpoint is just summarizing the high schools. So we have the CIP once again in the left-hand column. Now when we were looking at the one high school option, we did combine the CIP costs for both Hale and for Central in that scenario, so that there's a little asterisk there, which that CIP cost is just under $62 million. We did look at a low option, or a phased option, I should say, at the Central site as well as at the Nathan Hale site. Those were at $108 million and just under $100 million, and then the high budget range, which we talked about. We also did look at Dotke, which we didn't go through here today, but just what an option would be at that site. The CIP cost at Dotke was 10.5, and the low and the high are pretty similar, right around $15 million. And then the last piece was the athletic center, which we just went through, which totaled $53 million. So that's it for the from a budget standpoint.
Quick note on Dotke. Dotke is currently still proposed as the project-based learning high school. So it's not as though it's, just to be clear, it's not $15 million to make that a comprehensive high school. That has been proposed as the project-based learning high school as it currently exists.
So now we want to turn it back over to our board to get some questions answered. Those are some large dollar amounts. And so what about those surprised you? What are you still wondering? What are some of your thoughts? Heather?
So I see you have a hazmat cost, and I'm just gonna throw it out there that we are not the norm, so I'm just gonna say that whenever we've started something small, it turns into a huge project. So you have your normal cost, but I'll use like Central's gym floor, when we went to go do that. And they had it all priced out, we were gonna do it, and then they dug in and they found, was it mercury, I think? So that was not a norm. So what happens in those instances where you go into one of our buildings and you find this abnormal, extra, super expensive issue? Because we seem to have that a lot.
Yeah, if you ever watched a renovation show, they always run into something, right?
We're them.
Yeah,
That's
well,
us.
so, just starting with the hazardous materials, we did start with going to a firm and have them go through all the buildings and put together prices based on what they would anticipate, what they could see and what they would anticipate. So it was more than just historical in that situation. So I think we started in a step in more in the right direction. And then we escalated that to $23. But we have a construction contingency, and that's partially what that's there for, as well as that owner contingency and the soft costs are for those unforeseen things that do come up during renovation projects.
Okay.
Yep.
And then when you're looking at West Milwaukee, that expansion takes out the whole athletic field in the back. So have you gone to the city of West Milwaukee about removing all that green space? Because we talked about Hale and West Allis, but that's West Milwaukee, that's a different municipality.
We have not gone to the municipalities with any detail at this point. So that is always going to be a conversation
Yeah.
that has to be had with the communities. We will do that when we know a little bit more about, are we heading in the right direction, A? And B, if the community is interested in making that investment, we would definitely sit down with the municipalities.
Okay.
But your observation is correct there.
Yeah, and I did meet with John Stalewski in West Milwaukee, and then just talked conceptually. And one of the things I think that was important to them is that we continue to be committed to the two buildings that we currently operate in West Milwaukee, meaning we're going to continue to operate Pershing, we're going to continue to operate West Milwaukee. But they're likely coming with some renovation in order to do that. So that's kind of as much as the conversation as included at this point.
I'm just thinking back to Roosevelt and the issue with the playground and taking green space away from the city, even though it's not utilized. That would be a concern, I think, on their end.
Mhm.
Well, I think, just to jump in from the FAC committee, I think you're gonna find that if you actually look at a lot of the renovations, we're gonna make it, a lot of our east side schools, that's one of the issues that was brought up a lot, was green space. We will lose some green space, and we might have to figure out another way to kind of bring that in, whether it's, green roofs or,
Right.
Something on that line, because unfortunately, it just, a lot of our east side schools are just really condensed, they're in neighborhoods, there's just no room for expansion except for up, so.
Right.
I'm assuming kids that go to Lane would go to Frank Lloyd Wright?
For the most part, yes, it would mean a redivision of the neighborhood schools, right? So you'd have a shift, some of the kids that currently go to Frank Lloyd Wright would go to the West Milwaukee location, and then some of the kids from Lane, so it kind of just shift in more of a U shape, so that everybody was still within a reasonable neighborhood distance.
And I was just gonna say, it's kind of, I'm just a little disappointed that Frank Lloyd Wright hasn't been considered for a comprehensive high school. A, the space is huge. B, if now you're looking at an athletic complex 4 blocks this way, it's not that difficult for the community to take in that more centralized location.
Yeah, we can take a look at it. If I remember correctly, Frank Lloyd Wright's site is actually smaller in acreage than Hale, isn't it, Steve? And I don't have the specific numbers, but we can definitely provide it for you. That was kind of the initial gut check, is by the time, unless we built no athletic fields there and everything was traveling, then there's obviously viable solutions. But just the overall acreage being smaller, we felt like we were starting a little bit behind the current Hale site. I appreciate your commentary on location, though, that there's definitely an advantage there.
I'm just really concerned about that east side of our district. That's the biggest thing. And as a family member myself, you get very attached to your schools and what your expectation of what your school is going to be and where they're going. And I don't want an entire side of our district saying like, oh, well, they're gonna side over here. And I know it's gonna happen, but and I understand, this is not my field. I wanna do curriculum work, but, yeah.
Yeah, I think the next part of the agenda, when Bill presents on the survey, I have a sneaking suspicion we will clearly identify the site when we survey it, because we know how important it is.
Sure.
And the data would not be valid if we weren't being very clear with where the plan is. So we will get a statistically valid sampling of the community back that says whether that's an issue or not.
Okay.
In the months ahead.
Okay.
And that was a repeated issue for the FAC team as well. It's just circumstantially that wasn't as viable of an option anywhere else that we looked. But that was an issue for them as well. Jane?
So I'm getting the sense that we would have to do this in phases. So I'm wondering, you know, I'm not talking about the timeline, but would you be making recommendations to the board as to would we start with the comprehensive high school? Where would we start? Would we start with elementaries? Or is that something that you'd look to the board to decide on?
So it's been a little bit of all of the above, and just in trying to get a sense of where the board seems to be leaning, right? So that what you'll learn when we start to talk about the survey is our sense is we're leaning towards the high school as the place to begin, or secondary schools as the place to begin. And so I'm seeing some nods, so that's just a kind of general sense of where we think we're going. And so we've started to draft the survey questions with that assumption in mind. Because we have to pick something, right, to be able to go out and survey about. You can't ask, you know, a million questions and we'll have nothing that comes back that's helpful. But that's kind of, I believe, where we are. Where the community is why we do the survey. And maybe we learn something different. And then we'll, you know, come back to this table and say, okay, where are we as a result of what we've just learned?
And again, some of the logic being that if you were the fact team as well, it was an easier kind of sell on why one comprehensive high school made some sense to them, whereas some of those other decisions were quite a bit, some of the other suggestions or how do you align elementaries and intermediates were far more challenging for the fact team as well. And so that's where it seemed to make some logical sense for our whole community. Plus, if it were to be the one comprehensive at one site, every single learner gets to participate in that school. So that does actually have impact for every single one of our families. And so that's where there was some thought behind perhaps that being a logical place to start. Phil?
So have we thought about, you know, with this athletic center potential kind of idea with youth sports being a $300 billion industry, on how we could capitalize and, done properly, a facility like this, and what type of revenue that we could generate by potentially hosting without really doing anything to Fieldhouse, basketball, regional track events, regional national volleyball events. You know, what type of revenue stream can we bring in if we run the facility properly?
So, yeah, we've had some high-level conversations about it. That's why I think the idea was presented, and it's, I think, kind of intriguing of what it potentially opens up. It's also possible that we can lease the entire thing out to let somebody else run it, right? So that we're not taking on all of the operations for that, because there are entities that do that work as well. And so that's a level of detail that we're not really ready to drill into closely, but yeah, we've definitely kind of imagined some of those kind of opportunities.
I mean, we're talking millions of dollars potentially a year that you could bring in, done correctly, with the right facility and the right amenities type of scenario.
Yes, yeah.
Amy, and then we'll jump over to Brian.
This just kind of came to my mind. Has there ever been any, I don't think this came up in the FAC committee, but has there been discussions about if we would keep Docky in the same building, or if there's a possibility of, I don't know, necessarily putting it in a smaller environment at the new high school, or would we look at maybe a different building that would accommodate those fewer students and allow us to not put so much money, you know, like the old Docky building, though, the thing is old. I'm just curious if any thoughts have been about that in Docky and where they're at.
We did have some discussion about whether or not you use a different idled building that maybe doesn't need quite so much CIP work. Part of the challenge with that is what the students have already built out of what they have there on that location. And so you'd be redoing a lot of the student work when they've rebuilt some things in the facility themselves. And so that is a lower end cost when we look at the building itself, but that was some of the discussion as I went back to Greg and he said, please don't tell me you're gonna dismantle everything these kids have built for the last couple of years. I said, I'm not doing anything. But yes, that was a discussion. Like, does it actually make sense to have it continue there? Do we move it to one of the buildings that isn't gonna be used in the future? You know, what's the best way to handle that so that you're really investing the least amount you can to get out of it the most usage? Brian?
I wanted to piggyback off of Bill a little bit because, you know, what he brought up with some of that possible revenue from the athletic center and so forth. I think that analysis is important because when I look at that price tag associated with that, I can see a lot of people, and again, we don't have survey results, but I can see a lot of people saying, okay, we don't need that. Like, that's not important. So I think it's important to have that kind of analysis that says, well, wait a minute, it might add some value and this is how it's going to impact you as a community. On the flip side of that, if we get a clear sense that the community is not in favor of that, what are our backup plans for the tennis courts then? Because I know that was something that was going to be affected by the Hale plan. So what, I think you touched on it a little bit, but.
So the budget, I believe, has tennis courts included. So the budget for the single high school at the Hale site has the cost of constructing the courts included in it.
Okay.
The question is, where do they go? So I think we're
Gotcha.
covered on a cost perspective. Do they end up at Frank Lloyd Wright? Do they end up behind the police station? Do they end up at Central?
Okay.
Important, but we know we have the dollars to accomplish it.
Gotcha. So that 53 million then for the athletic center, that's not including the cost of the tennis courts because that's included in the Hale cost?
It's probably duplicated right now. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
And the tennis courts are about 50 million, so it's
I don't know that we're chipping away too much at that overall cost of the tennis courts.
It's funny that we can land at 52 million.
It's gonna have those auto line judges and everything.
Any other questions from our board? Yeah,
Well,
Heather?
kind of a little bit on Dodke, when you kind of touched a little bit on that. We have that awful, ugly blacktop in that small 15 million. Is there any thought to adding green space there or, build something there? Get rid of all that awful blacktop and do something there. Enhance that area. I mean, it's on Main Street. It's National Avenue. People see it, you know? I mean,
One of the things that we've also talked about at that back location is being able to do something different. It wasn't designed for what we've turned it into in recent years. But Steve, our coordinator of CTE, has got his eye on a bunch of that space to build a huge construction trade center. So we'll have some competition if there was an opportunity to repurpose some space for what to do with it. We want to expand agriculture. We want to expand a bunch of the opportunities for partner with the fair. Okay.
Future farmers.
There we go. Now I'll have our FFA, and so we
we
want
have
to
all that
open.
plexiglass. What are we
We
doing?
have-
Let's just build
We're
some
build-
greenhouses.
yes.
Come on.
These are excellent suggestions. I'll get right on that as soon as this meeting is over. Yeah, but yes, there's been a lot of discussion around if you idle a location, how do we give back as much green space as possible to the community, especially on the east end of town, right? And then if we are idling something or if we are investing some dollars in it, how does it continue to expand what's possible for kids? Always at the forefront of the conversations we've had so far.
Well, and it gives Dodke a more positive spin. I mean, that alternative high school is still there, even though you keep saying project-based. If people see that, like the honey at the farmer's market, people are like, what school does that? So something along that lines that gives it that new brand, that new name, that positive spin. And it's right on National Avenue. I mean, everybody drives by it, you know? I mean, who doesn't go down National Avenue?
The high end of the budget there had that outside space that Deidre talked about
Okay.
included in it. So it's a separate building in the parking lot area that could be an outdoor classroom, could be this construction space as well as redoing the parking lot. All right.
Keep my list.
A restaurant.
We've got a lot now. We have an app to develop, a farm, a construction trade site, and a food truck.
Yeah,
Right?
we're gonna
Okay.
do a restaurant.
Got it. I'm all on it.
Can you create a money tree while you're?
Could I grow a money tree? Excellent. Excellent. It is, we are fortunate that we have such brilliant students because these all sound like awesome projects for them.
Other questions? I have one question. In the most recent one comprehensive high school diagram, the first one that you showed, on slide 54, there's like a blue around where the track is. Is that indicating that the track is being resurfaced, or is that just a part of the diagram that was put in?
That's a good, no, that's the actual color of
That's
the
the
track.
color.
It's the Google.
It's the
It's-
aerial.
It is blue.
It's light blue?
It's light blue now. Yep. So it's just the Google shot.
Yeah, I've
looked like
had
it was filled in.
individuals that have come out and looked at the track, because I always want to make sure it's in good shape,
Yeah.
and there, it's in great shape, and there isn't any reason at this point to, to have to resurface it or anything at this point.
Okay, and if we have to resurface the football field, that won't affect the track?
No.
Okay.
And actually, to tie into what we talked about before with additional opportunities, right now, on either side of the football field, there are sand pits and like pole vaulting pits and that. What we've talked about is, from an operational standpoint, having sand and the synthetic field next to each other is not a good mix. So we've talked about, when we resurface the football field, that we relocate the sand pits to another place in the same facility, but just to another place. What that would also allow to do, and I met with some sports construction people, but also with our athletic directors, we're looking at, we think we'd be able to increase the size of the green space there, the synthetic field, about 15 feet to 20 feet on each side, which would mean then that we could have close to the same size soccer field that we currently have on the same site. So then we'd be able to have tournaments where we could have 2 games going on simultaneously. So we are always thinking about, if we're gonna do one thing, what can we do to make it just a little bit better and we get more use out of the same space?
Survey.
Like 20 slides to go.
Thanks for
Now the
waiting,
hard
Bill.
part.
We'll turn it to you.
I'll let you.
Matt, are you going to advance my slides for me?
Sure can.
All right, I'm Bill Foster. I'm the president and founder of School Perceptions. I've been in the peanut gallery watching this now for a while, and it's impressive. So just a little bit on our company. We are Wisconsin-based. We have worked in all 50 states. We've done staff, student, and parent surveys across the country. And I'm here tonight to talk about our community survey process. And we're up to over 800 community surveys for the sake of strategic planning and referendum preparation. In different states, they call it different things, but at the end of the day, we have to go to our taxpayers to ask for permission to spend their money. And my job is to objectively present, this is what we're thinking, what do you think? And then at the end of the day, if we can present, if we can represent our taxpayers, you will have a successful project. So we've been doing this for 20 years, and our mission is to help educational leaders gather, organize, and use data to make strategic decisions. By the way, I've been involved with many of those surveys, and I've sat through many of these meetings, and I have to say, sincerely, this administrative team and the Bray and C.D. Schmidt team have done an outstanding job. And your group, this work you've done, over 800 hours. A lot of districts kind of enter in this, and they kind of wing it, I guess. And they make up, they do some work, but you have done the hard work, and the FACT team, and it's really impressive. So I'm really honored to be part of it. So I come in, and my job is to conduct a community survey, and I take over 800 hours of work and a document that's now 70 megabytes. And my job is to boil it down to a survey that, and my audience is typically grandma and grandpa. We want them to be able to read it and understand what you've done. So this is no uneasy task. When we get done, we want people to be educated. So what are the primary issues that are driving your decision? So as they read the survey, one superintendent once said, this is like designing an interactive newsletter. And I thought that's a good way to describe it. So as you go through it, sure, we're going to ask you some questions, but we want you to be educated and learn about what's driving, what's primarily driving these decisions. Of course, when you do a survey, you want to gather data. Tax tolerance is always important. These numbers are big. We know that. And we also like to gather some overall satisfaction data, and I'm going to show you how we're going to do that in just a second. We believe, and we have found, that people are more likely to support a plan if they understand it, they're educated, and they have a voice in creating it. So if they can tell you, I like this better than that, if we can come up with that plan, you'll have more success. A long time ago, we used to do a thing called a random stratified sampling, where you go out and magically pick 100, 200, 400 people, you talk to them, you ask them, and then you extrapolate that and you say, we have confidence that this represents everyone. But we stopped doing that about 15 years ago. We said, that just doesn't make sense. What we want to do is what we call an inclusive process where everybody has the opportunity. You don't have to take it, but you have the opportunity. So a month later, you don't have a board meeting and somebody stands up at the microphone and says, well, you didn't ask me, I didn't get to take the survey, I want to tell you what I think. No, everybody gets the opportunity to take the survey, but take it once. So we do an inclusive process. It's mailed to every household in the district. People can take it online. We use a unique code. You put your code in, you get to take the survey once. If you go try to put the code in again, it'll say thanks, but you've already taken your survey. Or for those folks that don't have internet access or want to have a cup of coffee when they respond, they can take it via paper. They put it into a business reply envelope. It comes back to School Perceptions. We enter that data and include those results along with the people that take it online. So it is an inclusive process, and we don't want anybody to get left out. So the call to action is to take the survey. Just put this in as a little screenshot so you could kind of see they're going to go to a website, they're going to enter their number. We also want to make accommodations that if somebody else in your household who's also an adult that wants to take it, we have provisions so you can ask for a second survey. You can't ask for 50 surveys, but you can ask for a second survey. We also make the survey available in multiple language, again, to be inclusive. So this is actually, we began writing, and this is actually your district. So I'm going to read this for, it's a little small. Dear community members, like other school districts in the state, the West Allis, West Milwaukee School District has been dealing with declining enrollment. In Wisconsin, school funding is tied to enrollment. Thus, the fewer students we have, the less money we receive. In 1975, over 12,000 students attended our schools. Today, we serve 7,400 students across 2 comprehensive high schools, 1 project-based learning high school, 3 intermediate schools, and 11 elementary schools. Given our declining enrollment forecast, we cannot afford to continue to heat, clean, and maintain all 17 schools. Consolidating schools would also allow us to operate more efficiently. Therefore, the district has made it a priority to develop a plan to right-size the district. To accomplish this goal, the Facility Advisory Community Team, or FAC, was formed last year. This group consisted of 1 parent, 1 staff member from each school, school leaders, community stakeholders, and 2 board members who did not vote. Ultimately, any planning going forward must reflect the priorities of our taxpayers. Therefore, please take 5 to 10 minutes to take the survey, and they're working with School Perception. So this is a draft of the opening letter that then the call to action will be, please take our survey. So we're still working on it, but in a nutshell, when I reviewed everything that you had done, it's really about declining enrollment, and we have to operate more efficiently. The one word that I might add to this is the district has made it a priority to right-size, and I think Marty said it early, and modernize. We want to do those 2 things, so I already want to.
I was gonna say real quick, take out where it says 2 comprehensive high schools. If we're gonna, we keep calling it the new high school, the comprehensive high school. I'm just wondering if that's not gonna throw off some people.
Well, we just currently operate 2 high schools.
Yeah.
Okay.
The English
So this is
teachers.
exactly what we want the board's feedback on, is do we have the message right? This is a preliminary draft, but those sorts of things. So that's the opening letter. So this thing is going to get, right now, we've got it designed, at least conceptually, to be on 8 pages. So it'll be 2 11 by 17 sheets of paper. They'll get stapled or stitched, as they say in the printing world, so it'll be a little booklet. This is the first page. It'll be a letter that'll come from administration and the board, and then we're going to ask them to go ahead and take the survey. When you go to the next page, we're going to ask a little demographic information. We want to be sure we ask their age to make sure that our seniors are well represented in the data. We're going to see if they are an employee of the district. That's important. And by the way, if your staff isn't on board, you're dead in the water. So we have to understand where the staff is as a group. However, the staff represents less than 1% of our community. So they're going to be a subgroup we're going to analyze. We're going to look at our parents. Your parents probably represent about 25% of your community. But the majority of your voters neither work in the district nor have kids in the district. They get the most votes, literally, and you have to listen to those folks probably with a little more weight than the other 2 groups. And then we will be able to disaggregate the data by which municipality they live in. Right now, at least the way we've got it sketched out, I like to ask some overall satisfaction questions. These are normed and benchmark questions, so we can compare you to other similar districts. And also, people's satisfaction highly correlates with referendum support. So that also gives us some insights. And then there's some financial background information. And I thought it was interesting that you have had a declining mill rate. Our district has significantly improved our financial situation over the last 5 years. Due to our cost management efforts and long-term financial planning, our credit rating has improved 7 steps and is now rated as Moody's as high grade. We adjusted our expenses to reflect our declining enrollment and to maintain financial stability. Our tax mill rate, which is used to calculate the district's portion of property tax bills, is at its lowest level over a decade and is projected to decrease once again in 2021, 2022. So we've got a little chart for the visual learners. We explain that. There's no survey question yet. We then go to the next page, and again, to reinforce, it's really the declining enrollment that's driving a lot of that. Our district currently operates 17 schools and serves approximately 7,400 students. During the past 6 years, student enrollment has dropped nearly 2,500 students. Based on a recent study, enrollment will likely continue to decline at a slow, steady rate and eventually stabilize. So I think when you look at that chart, you can kind of see it's gone, and then, so we're kind of at a point now where, all right, maybe we're going to, now we can develop a plan around this enrollment level. Because it is not possible to selectively heat and maintain portions of the building, money is spent on areas that are either not being used or are being underutilized. So again, background information that we're envisioning that would be contained in the survey. And then there's really 3 more areas. Aging buildings, regular maintenance has helped us extend and in some cases exceed the expected lifespan of our schools. However, on average, our buildings are more than 75 years old. These older buildings are more expensive to maintain, heat, and clean. Many building systems, and this is the CIP, such as heating, electrical, plumbing, roofs, windows, et cetera, have reached or exceeded their service lives. It's difficult to pay for these large capital maintenance projects out of the general operating budget without directly impacting programs for our programs and services for our students. And then we've got some ADA issues, and we've got outdated classrooms and support areas. So those are, again, background information. So this kind of sets up. And now we're going to go to the next page of the survey, which we don't have tonight because we're waiting to hear what the board wants to do. Just based on my experience and kind of looking at this, it does seem like the first big decision is 1 high school or 2. And if there is consensus and support from the community to make an investment at that level, everything else kind of flows out of it. If they don't, and they might not, then you go down a different road. But and that's also going to be the biggest expense, I think, at the high school level. So I think we should test that. And then if we look at a 6-12 solution or intermediate and high school solution, then my logic would be then we would then go on to test the investment at the intermediate level. And at that point, you might run out of money. I don't know, I guess that's up to the board. We'll go as far as you want to go. In other districts, we've tested much, much bigger numbers, such as, like a Wauwatosa or something like that. But I think at that point, you're probably going to hit, based on my experience, a tax threshold by this community saying, we're in for this plan, but it is going to have to be done in phases. I think you're right. And this is what we want to bite off first. And this is what we're proposing. And would you support not only the plan, but also the dollar amounts associated with that, and ultimately the tax impact that would affect me as a property owner?
So with the survey, you talked about a specific number. What if someone does it online and mails it in? How do you decide which one is the one you keep?
We can test that. So
Okay.
when they mail it in, we have their number.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if their answers are the same, but if they vary?
Well, what we typically do is we'll discard the mailed-in version then.
Okay.
But we've done this a lot. And what we've found is we don't have to worry about that very much. And if one person were to do that, it will not change the statistics whatsoever. So we're pretty confident in our process. We're about 95% accurate in our predictions in Wisconsin. Right now, in Minnesota, I think we're actually perfect. So at some point, we'll be wrong, but it's a very, very predictive process. You might not like the answers, but at the end of the day, it's the people who take the survey have developed an opinion, and they're the ones who typically vote. They're also the ones who typically influence their friends and neighbors, or this is a terrible idea, or this is a good idea, or this is time. But at the end of the day, after I've done so many of these, we know it's very predictive. So it's a.
Talk about the response rate. We talked about that quite a bit in our meetings and what your expected response rate would be.
We actually measure every project we've done. Last year, we averaged 22%, which was actually up. I guess pandemic are good years for taking surveys. People sad, got nothing else to do. So before that, we were probably 18, 19%. We were up to 22. The other thing that it depends. Bigger districts will tend to have a little bit lower response rate just because they're bigger. So for instance, right now we're doing Mankato. We did Rochester. And some of those will be a little bit lower just because you're going to be mailing out a lot more surveys. But I would expect with a district this size, you'd probably see around 18%. Statistically, and this is where it's kind of weird, when you hit 400 responses, what you'll see is it won't change a whole lot, maybe 1% one way or another. So as you go, I had one superintendent that was looking at the data as it was coming in. He called me and he said, started at 400, and then when it hit 4,000, he kept saying, it's like looking at his bond portfolio or his stock portfolio. It's like, it's not changing, it's not changing. I said, that's the way statistics work. They kind of lock in. So you're going to have very, very good data because you're going to have you'll have many thousands of people taking the survey.
So we send out the survey because we obviously want to, get a read. But to me, it feels a little backwards because wouldn't we want to inform and educate the population first and say, because they're going to send it back and we're dead in the water. They're going to be like, no, no. But if we hold community outreach meetings and we show them all the benefits and how will this benefit you as a community member, and we do all of those things, I think they're more apt to buy into it. But we never even get to that if they take the survey and they say, no, we're not really going to support this.
That's a great question. So think of it as a pebble in the pond. The first wave is your staff. And you really have to spend time and make sure your staff is very aware of what you're proposing to do because they're talking to their friends, their neighbors, and the parents every day. The parents are really the second wave, and they're interested. I think many of you are parents, and you're pretty engaged. You're interested in what's going to happen. The third wave are the non-parent, non-staff, which of course represent the majority of our voters. You could serve pizza, and they probably wouldn't show up. You're not good. It's very difficult to engage those people, but it's true. You want to spend time and have a strategy to engage staff and parents, and then trickle out everything you can think of to continue to inform the non-parent, non-staff about this. But at the end of the day, this survey will likely be the first time that some of that third wave will hear about it.
And that would be regardless of how much outreach we did.
Yeah.
We've done probably 40 specific survey-related listening sessions over the last 5+ years, and we're lucky to get 15 to 20 people to attend. So not saying we shouldn't do them, and using the survey to advertise a listening session or two is a great way to take advantage of that mass mailing to the community anyway, if that's something you're interested in. But I think in our experience, and Bill validates it, you're not going to drive enough participation to make a big difference. The other part is I think if we get our non-parent, non-staff to read 8 pages, that's a good start. And if they see a solution that makes sense to them, and the cost to them, the total cost matters, but the cost to them as a taxpayer is the most important. If those two things make sense, and you say this better than I do all the time, Bill, they're probably going to go for it. If they think it's a bad idea and it's extremely expensive, then we're going to run into that kind of pretty persistent pushback, which we'll find through data as well. And no matter how much we communicate, we're not going to get past that.
So you're a survey expert. Do you craft those questions so that they can see a benefit through the way that they respond? Or is there a way for you to educate them through the survey?
Well, we certainly try to educate, but we don't try to advocate. So we're not saying this is the best deal you're ever gonna get.
Right.
But we say, based on all the work we've done, the work of the FAC group, this is their recommendation. We believe this is the most cost-effective, long-term solution for this school
Right.
district. And if, for whatever reason, they don't believe it, don't like it, we'll find that out. Our job is to present the facts.
Right. Okay.
Other questions? I just had a quick question, because I mentioned about surveying the staff, which most of don't live in our community. So is that going to be done all at the same time, or are we going to do the staff separately? And obviously, it's gonna be super, super important that that data is separated out. Because at the end of the day, the staff are affected by it, by the results of it, if anything happens.
Right.
But they're not physically financing any of it, and I can see,
Right.
I can hear one or two community members right now yelling that they shouldn't have any input.
One or two? I've
because
heard
they're
that
not
yelling
paying
too.
for it.
No, so, and Matt just brought up the demographic, in which community do you reside? One choice is do not live in the district.
Right.
And if you take the survey and you don't live in the district, you're not counted. So you're gonna see the word resident pop up in the financial support questions, once we have a financial support question, and they will not have a voice in that question. So you have to live in the district to be counted for that. So you might have, you might have 93% of the sample live in the district, and then you'll have that data.
Okay, all right, and that would be separated out, and not included in our choices that we should be picking. and
Right.
not-
They'll still be, we'll still have their data, we can represent it, but not when it comes to financial support.
And the bigger impact for staff is just them having the information.
Mhm.
So that as families go back to staff to say, hey, you're my child's third grade teacher, what do you think of this whole thing? That's where it's so important that staff are able to say, this is what I think about, this is the big idea, or this is where that's coming from, or what would be, happens in our community.
Well, and it's really important, we worked with a district I won't name that's very large in the central part of the state. And they did a survey and they found out their staff was not on board with what was being proposed. So they slowed down and then spent a year before they went out, because the staff really didn't like the solution or didn't understand it yet. So they had to double back and spend some time. And if they're not on board, you're not gonna be successful. So you need to know that, even if they don't live in the district, because they're talking to parents every day.
Any other questions? So the timeline for this was,
I guess I have a question really quick. Well, kind of going on the timeline thing is, so at this point, you want to know what our next step is in the survey. But is in the timeline, aren't we voting on what we're going to do next, like later in the process? So can maybe add, like Marty or Deirdre can.
Yeah. Well, do you want to go into the?
So we had kind of next steps was the next slide, so you're well ahead of us,
Okay,
which is
sorry,
great.
sorry.
So Marty, do you want to touch on what's next? And we can talk specifically to the survey timing if you would like. I can jump back to that as well, but next steps are up on the screen now.
Yeah, so it really is, again, reviewing the recommendations from FACT, so we want to let this now sit kind of in your brains for a couple of weeks, because this is a lot in 2.5 hours. And so we'll revisit that. We'll come back with more specific kind of questions in the survey, kind of leaning into the high school and secondary solutions. So we see how that starts to get presented. And then it's going to be more time in discussion. And then at the next regular meeting, if we're ready to move forward coming out of August 16th, we'll put it on the agenda to approve the survey. It's kind of where we're going. And if you want to talk more about then the implementation timeline of the survey.
I think right now we actually have right now we had put together a template that had us going out really and finalizing the survey in mid to late September. Is that what you have there, Matt?
Yeah, so we assuming that it feels like after August 16th, the board's ready to keep moving forward, then at the end of the month of August, right, at the regular meeting at the end, we'll ask for approval, and that keeps us on the timeline to go in September.
Takes about 6 weeks to print, mail, get data back, so that's built into this. That's the deployment line within the macro level schedule, which would have results back to you as a board in late October, early November, somewhere in that time frame. It would give you, 6 to 8 weeks to review that data, make any refinements, make any decisions on if you want to proceed, and if so, how. And then we would be able to meet our statutorily required deadline to formally approve resolutions to go to referendum at the board level. You can push into late January. We would strongly encourage that to be early January, so that we can really do that community engagement, communication work in earnest. So I don't want to say you have to be early January, because technically it can be later, but we would encourage no later than early January, if at all possible.
How long do you typically leave a survey like this open?
So the survey is open typically for 3 weekends, 2 weeks. So if it's too long, the procrastinators never take it, but if it's too short and you're on a vacation, you're typically not on vacation for 3 weeks, or 3 weekends. If you are, you're
Pretty lucky.
live in Florida or something like that. Take me with you.
Right.
But, so that we found that to be kind of just the perfect amount of time.
So will we have separate sessions for staff? Because the state community outreach is put into after we launch this survey. Will we have separate sessions for staff then to try to provide this? And can we, if we've decided on the 16th, what questions can we start that process earlier?
Yeah, so part of, we've talked about doing some recorded presentations or videos. Deidre and I, and maybe more of the team now, maybe this includes like Steve this year, we'll do the kind of tour of schools where we do kind of a welcome meeting with every single staff. And I think if we've gotten direction from the board on August 16th, I think we'll start to shape those meetings differently than we have in the past. Usually it's been about kind of where we are in the strategic plan, really focused on learning, and maybe this part of the strategic plan, we really need to emphasize where we are in the facility work. So we'll be in every single building within a matter of kind of weeks at the beginning of the school year, and then I think we'll do some just more open forum kind of sessions for staff as well, because those meetings typically involve teachers, which is the key communicators, but there's also secretaries and custodians, and we want to make opportunities for them to participate as well.
And then for the survey itself, which I understand we're going to be working on for the next time, but will it be will the survey go across the entire amount, even if we're only asking about secondary schools, but the entire plan, as you mentioned, like we're looking to idle X amount of buildings, X amount of elementary schools, so that when someone is making a decision, like you're really buying into an entire plan. The plan might take 15 years to complete, but you're saying, like, I'm saying yes to this question with understanding there's going to be another question later on that's going to address the entirety of the plan, because I can see people who aren't interested in the secondary buildings, but are interested in the elementary buildings, like, well, what about those? And so if we don't have anything in the communication piece about those, we might lose those people as far as their interest and support.
It's a great question, and I think the problem is, though, at the elementary level, if the board is comfortable in recommending that we lead with the high school, which I think is most, I see heads that kind of went, yeah, this is the most logical, then you go to the secondary or intermediate level. I don't believe we have a specific plan to say this is exactly what we're gonna do at the elementary level. What we can say is that we're going to reduce the number of elementary schools we have. But in terms of which ones or exactly when that's gonna happen, we don't know. And I think that's honest, and I think that's what you tell people. This is the path we're going down, and we're not asking you to support money to do that at the elementary level now either. There will be money required, but we can't afford to do it all at once. So I think that's as far as we can go right now with what we know, and then so you tell people what you know. But
Well, that's what I would look for, though. I wouldn't want to be like, well, here's our plan for the secondary schools. Please vote for that, or let me know what you think about that. And people are like, what about the elementary? So
Right.
as long as we have something in there, like
It'll
this
be a
is what our vision's
future
going to be,
phase,
yeah.
yep.
Not
That's
included in this, but this is what we envision that would be happening on a large scale.
Yep.
And then that will be a future
Yep.
thing that would be looked at.
No, that's exactly where we're sketching right now.
And one of the things we talked about including in the information was the fact that we may idle some elementary schools even if we weren't going forward with construction on others at the present moment. And so making sure that the community is aware, you're not voting to never do something like that or not ever approach some of that work. So crafting that is why you hire a company to do that versus us trying to develop the survey, because Bill has done this a number of times and he knows how to craft the language in there to make sure we're as transparent as possible
Right, right.
about the longevity, you know, the gravity of the whole plan, but yet get the specific information we need right now to know if we're ready to take a next step.
Yeah, really, one of the big challenges is if that were to be done in 5 years, it would cost X, 10 years is gonna be 2X.
Yeah.
20 years would be 4X, and we don't know. So you can't really say this is the cost.
There's an interesting dynamic, the elementary schools, when we're, from the date we survey to the time we'd actually potentially implement that elementary school piece, maybe the kindergartners that are currently in school would be affected, because it'll take 4+ years to go through this whole process. And so it's as much about being able to very clearly communicate not only which schools may be consolidated, but how, the process, are students gonna be moving, what are the boundaries? There's just so many other pieces that can't be communicated in the survey. So I think as long as you're comfortable with making sure we're transparent that it's part of the plan, it's just not a phase now, I think we can tackle that pretty easily.
I think that's the key part, just, I don't want people to think, well, so you're just not doing nothing with elementaries, because really, that was a lot of the discussion was around elementaries. And for that to be, I mean, not that we're gonna do that, but if that is what happens, you know, people are gonna be a little bit confused. So what do you mean, you're not doing anything with elementaries? So I think that we need to make sure that that is clear, like this is not forgotten, but it's just not something that has been decided to be going forward immediately. And so they can move forward with that process. The other thing I'd like to see included would be the history of referendums in our district. Because the other thing that I think is important to point out to people is it's been a long time since a referendum has been passed in our district.
Okay.
And it's something that a lot of times people say, well, you're always asking for money, but in reality, that's not true. And so having, it might be a sentence, but just something that's saying, like, you know, last time that we have asked for a building referendum was this date, and the last time one was passed was this date, something to that effect.
And I think it's important to say building referendum
Building.
versus operational.
Right.
Yep.
Because we remember that debate a
Yeah,
couple
right.
years ago.
Something clearly saying this is for renovations of buildings, not for operational costs.
Yeah.
And that, like, statutorily, if this is passed, we cannot use it for operational costs. We've been accused of a lot of things over the last few years about our referendums, so.
Okay.
I'm just gonna add too, we had a lot of this discussion internally about going all the way from the things that you're saying, Noah, to Jane's pieces about, educating our community. And Bill always brings us back to, this is what 75% of your people they're only gonna read this 8-page document. Like, this is all you have to educate our community, and bringing us back to how do we get the pieces that we need for people to understand, like, the nitty-gritty of why you might support something like this. So, those are all pieces of the conversations that we've also been asking, and Bill always brings us back to, like, his expertise and how we can move forward with that, so.
Is there any data you could include about, I don't know if it exists or not, if once a referendum is passed, if there's like an increase in property values that, or, you know, that are associated with it? Does anything of that exist out there? I don't know.
I think there's one study from Finland or Norway, and
We're just like them.
it's been hard to translate it exactly, so I've only found one that actually has
Yeah.
gone deep enough with
If you
data.
don't ask, you don't know.
The architects in the state would be thrilled to have that, but anecdotally, I think it does exist.
Oh.
I really do believe it does, but my thought was to go out and do it through real estate values in communities that are near each other. And I think it could actually be done, because there is cases where you've got neighboring communities where you had passage and failures, and the corresponding home values really begin to correspond, and open enrollment changes over time. But it's hard to isolate that variable and say it's absolutely, this is what's causing it, because there's
Sure.
other things too, but.
And then Bill will say, well, now we have one more line that we've just
Yeah.
added, so.
Yeah, that isn't gonna go in the
Make it
survey.
nice.
He'll learn he can't count past 8 as we move through this process.
I mean, what's a 12-page survey?
We did work with one district where that ended up at 16 pages.
Oh.
It was actually a
Brevity.
great project too, so.
It was painful.
And it was.
It worked.
It worked,
so I'll
but it
give 'em
was,
that,
and it
but-
had one of the lowest response rates of any survey we've ever done.
Well, I can imagine. I'm not reading.
I wouldn't recommend that.
Just lost everybody.
Other questions?
The only thing I was gonna add on to that is just, I just don't wanna, I wanna make sure that our survey's not too cumbersome, because people are not gonna fill it out if there's too many pages. And I mean, even though we say it's only 5 to 10 minutes responses, and I know, so I think we have to keep in mind, we have to balance how much information we're providing, but we also have to remember that there's gonna be people who are like, you know what, I'm just too, you know what, and they're gonna throw it aside because you see all those words and you're like, whatever. So I think we just have to balance that out. We have to be able to provide the right information, but also be brief in it, get to the point, you know, so.
It's true, if we could do it in 4 pages, it would have probably, it would, instead of being 22%, it would be up to about 26% response rate. But in this case, you've got, this is a very complicated process you've gone through. So I don't think we can get it down to 4, but we'll do our best to keep it as concise as we can.
Other questions? Otherwise, I have closing remarks.
Oh, Sandy?
Yeah,
I think that's you.
I think it was just see you in 2 weeks. Thank you.
Right.
Given that you bared with us for an extra half an hour tonight,
Right.
so.
We really try to keep these at 2 hours, so I think everybody's expiring at the present time.
Yeah, we're not done yet.
We're not done yet.
Oh, shoot, that's right.
It's not even
No.
11.
Hey.
It's not like 2015. That's all
I
I'm
think
gonna say.
I appreciate the team that's working with us and everybody internally that's been part of this, and just, the board's time and commitment and attention to this, and that you're staying engaged for 2.5 hours. And a lot of you already are familiar with, and that you're still kind of, really pushing us forward, I appreciate, because it's both kind of scary time, but also exciting. If we can do something powerful with facilities, it'll take us to another level, so more to come.
And I just want to thank Amira for coming tonight and.
And staying the whole time.
Yes.
It said fact at the beginning, but it said community members, it didn't say students. So we had.
Oh, that's right.
It's cool.
Awesome.
Good luck in your senior year.
Yes.
Yes.
All right, so now we have a 5-minute recess.
Cut her to 2.
Doesn't matter to
Do we
me.
have to recess?
We don't
Can we
have
just-
to recess
can
if
we
nobody
just
wants to.
No,
Let's
let's
just
go.
We have to
on.
let, we have
This
to let our
part
guests
is done.
leave.
We have a little business that has to get
Give me a minute 30.
Okay, 2-minute recess.
1, 2, 3.
Yeah, we're twinsies.
Minute 15 now, Bill.
Too funny.
Thank you, everyone, for all your work.
Thank you, board. Really great questions and conversation. Appreciate it.
Okay, all right. Welcome back, everyone, from our brief recess. We have one action item on the agenda tonight, item 8.1, regarding suspending policy readings, bylaws and policies 131.1, and approved policy revision, voting 167.1. Dr. Litzman.
Yes, thank you. So this is really to accommodate, officially accommodate board members being present and being able to vote when you're in Zoom, right? So when you're participating virtually, and all of those kind of rules and those kind of things were suspended up until recently during COVID, and we worked with our attorneys last year. But since we've adopted the Neola policies, our current policy language, Claire Hartley, the attorney that's advised us on this, her exact language is she's reasonably comfortable with the current language, but would like our policy to explicitly provide for remote participation. When we started the Neola process, it was pre-COVID, and so Neola had language that would have allowed for that. We elected not to include that language when we went through it pre-COVID. We're like, we'll never need this. And the world changed. And so the language that's being proposed is the exact language from the original Neola policy. We've just reintroduced it through our Neola consultant. Claire Hartley did review it, and so she supports that language, but in order to have it in place for the next regular meeting, which is next week, Monday, she advised that we then need to suspend the policy around the adoption of policy, and that actually is anticipated, this gets so confusing, is anticipated in current policy, that the board has in policy the opportunity to suspend policy for temporary purposes, and it happens from time to time that you need to waive or suspend certain policies in order to be efficient or get some things done. And so the motion that we're recommending, right, is to suspend that specific policy to allow for the adoption, the immediate adoption of the revised voting policy or bylaw. They're actually bylaws. Because otherwise it would have to go through committee for a first reading and a second reading. And if the board supports this evening with the suspension and the approval of the new language, it's on the books immediately. And then we're covered more explicitly covered from Claire Hartley's perspective for next week. And she was really advising that if you have any kind of higher stakes votes coming up, that you don't want to have challenges on technicalities, right? So whatever direction, obviously I'm talking about the mask piece that'll come forward next week. And so whatever the board decides and the direction you give us next week, we want that to be the direction, and we're not revisiting this 2 weeks later. And so that's why we're introducing this now.
All right, does anyone have any questions about all that? Kristen?
Now I'm just surprised we weren't ADA compliant in that before, like this kind of covers that base as well. You know what I mean?
No, it's an interesting point, right, to provide different ways for access, right.
Because we don't know when the future will be on this board, so it's a lot more inclusive, I think.
It is. No, it's a good point.
Any other questions or comments? And obviously, the intent of this change is not so that everyone then is going to be operating remotely from this point on. The whole point is that we're traveling for business, we're traveling for pleasure, we're ill, but not so ill that our mental faculties are not allowing us to actually comprehend and participate in the meeting, but we still want to participate as board members or future board members. And I think, for me personally, I want to make sure as elected officials that we can participate in as many meetings as we can and be able to provide our perspectives and our input on all the things that we have to vote on. So I think it's really important that we do it. But the intent is not that like, okay, now, I'm going to be remote all the time because, I don't want to drive here. No, that's not the point. The point is that if there's extenuating circumstances or I'm not in town, but I still want to participate, then I can. And there's no worries about that for everyone and hopefully for ever. It's 21st century. I mean, this really is actually something I think that was a long time coming. We're just missing the boat on it, so. All right. Any other questions or anything? Otherwise, I look for a motion.
So moved.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any last minute discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? All right, that passes. All right, and then I need a motion for adjournment?
Move to adjourn. Second.
Third. All right, we have a few of those. All those in
I was the
favor?
first to say.
Aye.
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 Everyone said
Aye.
I think. All right. Opposed? We are adjourned. Thank you very much, everyone.
Don't let's